All right, we turned off the live captions. Or so I thought. Okay, is that off now? Good. Okay, it's not. All right, very well. I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and we'll get the lecture going here. Does anybody have any questions or anything moving forward on a paper topic or anything while I get this up?
Yeah, I know you said you wanted to talk with me a little bit more about that. Last time we talked about doing the entirety of chapter 23 in Joshua. So I'm hoping I can continue to do that for my paper topic. But if you want to talk more about it afterwards or schedule another time, that's fine.
Yeah, for just a couple minutes after. I mean, that shouldn't be an issue. Yeah. So I do recall you last time. So, all right. Can you guys see them sharing screen here?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so last week we looked at Joshua, and so we're going to head on in, and we're talking about the former prophets as prophetic books, right? Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. We looked at Joshua, the transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua, and here we're going to see from Joshua to the tribe of Judah. I'm going to see a number of things transition here. And so let's just go ahead and dive into Judges. So in Joshua, we also saw these main themes of the man and the land. Of course, Joshua presented as a prophet in the mold of Moses, among other things as well, presented as eschatological figure. Now, as we look at the book of Judges here, so the title of the book, of course, is presumably derived from Judges 2:16 through 19. Here at the beginning, where we read that Yahweh raised up judges, Shotim, to deliver Israel. So beginning verse 16, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. So we have here, and that's in the opening part there in chapter 2. We get the main cycle of Judges there, the central portion of the book from Judges 3 through 16. Here's chapter 2, for example, the discussion there of the judges that God raises up. So, as is the case with every book title in the Bible, this has been handed down by tradition. We talk about the title of this. These books do not come with a cover like today's books with the title on it, but it's simply handed down by tradition. Now, in this case, both the Hebrew and the Greek and Latin traditions are the same. So we talk about the term judge within this book. It's certainly a broader term semantically than that of modern Western society, what we think of with judges here. And so when we talk about the term, the semantic range of the term, we have to look at how it actually functions, how it's actually used within the book itself. And so certainly a broader use of this in the book of Judges. So, so in the Torah, for example, we see that judges are appointed in Israel by Moses. They're in Exodus 18 in a role that's not unlike a modern judge. To hear the smaller cases and say the larger ones to bring before Moses. And so his father-in-law give counsel on that, right? In Deuteronomy 16 and 17, he appoints judges for each town and a higher court there at the tabernacle as well. In the book of Judges, in addition to such a role as this, you see that they take on also prophetic and military roles. Not just merely judges in the sense that we see in modern Western society, or more importantly, that we see in the Torah, but in this sense, they are prophets. So, for example, Deborah, a prophetess, they take on military roles, advising the generals and so on. So the original ideal, let me move this here. The original ideal of a judge, as described in the Torah, there in Exodus 18, for example, included fear of God. And so we see in Numbers that they are to fear the Lord. And this is quite frankly a quality that is lacking in many of the figures portrayed in the book of Judges. So an interesting presentation. So one reason why the title Judges might be suitable for this book is the fact that they disappear in the last 5 chapters. Interesting, after the Judges, kind of the central portion there, chapters 3 through 16, the narratives dealing with the Judges, we hit 17 through 21, and there's an absence there at that point. The expectation that punctuates these final chapters is a king who will solve the moral dilemma, the chaos, the anarchy that exists in Israel at that time. In fact, 4 times we see the statement, there was no king in Israel, twice adding the refrain, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So there's this expectation of this king, and that when he comes, he will resolve this moral dilemma. He will effect obedience, if you will, unlike what was happening in the book of Judges, for example. This idea of the Shoftim, these judges as deliverers as well. So another characteristic that we see, for example, where I just read in Judges 2:16, is the role of deliverer. And you see the root there, Yasha. So they are referred to as deliverers. So nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. So as prophets, as judges functioning in the way that we think of typically, but also as prophets, also as military leaders, and deliverers in that role as well. So Othniel, for example, at the beginning is called a deliverer, a savior there. Again, lowercase s, obviously. And so is Ehud there in Judges 3:15. And we also see the verbal form of Yasha used for other judges, right? The act of delivering there. Shamgar, Gideon, Tola, and others as well. So this is terminology used as in reference to the role of the judges. So a more or less supernatural intervention appears to be what is meant here, that God is raising up these judges, and we see that explicit statement there. The Lord is the one raising up these judges and calling them, much like in the fashion of Moses, in a sense, right? God raised up Moses, right, and used him as a deliverer for his people. God is raising up judges here to deliver his people. So, sorry for the typo. That's not, it's note. Note how Yahweh in Judges 11:27, for example, is designated by Jephthah as the ultimate judge there. Also the idea, again, as I mentioned, the judges as prophets, so as deliverers, but also as prophets. So as I mentioned already, Deborah is called a prophetess there in Judges 4:4. There's another unnamed individual in Judges 6:8, also referred to as a prophet. And so we see that Deborah fulfills a number of roles, including the prophetess and judge that we see there in 4 through 6. So now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidot, was judging Israel at that time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. Then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor? take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. All right. And against you, I will deploy Sisera, etc. So it's interesting here. You really see three different things mentioned there. She's a prophetess. The people are coming to her for judgment as well. So in the sense of a judge, like what Moses had appointed, but then she's also the commander in chief, if you will. It appears something of that sort here as well. So as was the case with Moses and Joshua before, these leaders in the book of Judges were not given a delimited job description, but rather they were people that were anointed by God. It is God who raised them up. So they were anointed, they led, and they were empowered by God's Spirit. And as such, they were qualified to lead the nation. So after the monarchy is established in Samuel, right, in the following book, we also see individuals there, such as Saul and David, who are prophesying, right? Both having been anointed by Samuel. Of course, another leader who is referred to as a prophet, according to 1 Samuel 3. And Samuel is also the last of the judges in that sense. So Samuel serves that transitional role there as the final judge, also as a prophet who anoints the first and second kings of Israel. And that transition period he oversees from the period of the judges to the monarchy. We'll come back to Samuel, of course, when we get to the book of Samuel. So really, as a result, what we see, there's not really a modern term as we think of judge that really adequately covers the role of these individuals in the book of Judges, right? There's no judge in any sense of the term as we understand it in modern Western society that fulfills these roles, as not only one who hears and judges cases, but also serves as a prophet and also serves as a military leader and a deliverer in that sense and so on. All right. So this title, really, the term judge, again, we're stuck with these, as Robert Alter put it, this series of compromises, right? You're always having to make these decisions. What kind of terminology do we want to use in English? And so the term judge is used, shafat, the verb form there to judge. And it's fine. We talk about the Shof team as judges there. But understanding we have to look at the actual function of these figures within the text itself and let that determine the range and meaning as we understand it, and not modern terminology reading back into it. So I always want to be careful there. All right, so we talked about literary parallels with the book of Joshua. And there are many things. I'm just going to mention a few things, but just want to start to kind of get into some of these things with Judges, which follows Joshua. So some literary parallels there. We see the conquest of Hebron and Debir and the giving of Achsah in marriage to Othniel, the judge there in Joshua 15. Those are also found in Judges chapter 1 as well. We see the failure to dispossess the Jebusites in Joshua 15. That's also repeated in Judges chapter 1. But it's attributed to a different tribe in this case, interestingly enough. We also see the failure of Manasseh to dispossess the Canaanites in Joshua 17. That also repeated in Judges chapter 1. Notice they're also following the same order as well. We also see the failure of Ephraim to dispossess the Canaanites in Joshua 16, and they're in Judges 129. And we see the naming of Dan in Joshua 19:47 and in Judges 18 as well. And of course, the verses concerning the obituary there, Joshua, in the final chapter of Joshua, are repeated in Judges chapter 2, verses 7 through 9, but in a different order. So again, at the end of Joshua and also at the front end of Judges, in similar fashion to what happened with Moses there at the end of the Torah and the reference to him at the beginning of Joshua. So we see a number of things going on, the repetition there from Joshua into really much of the outset of the book of Judges here. Another interesting thing here that I want to address are a number of ironic allusions to Joshua in the prologue and epilogue of Judges. So at the beginning and end of Judges, bookending around the narratives there, the Judges there, some interesting things here. So there's an interesting allusion to the taking of Jericho, which you see, of course, Joshua 2, and of course, the taking of Jericho as they go in, but the taking of Jericho in Joshua 6. And also in the presentation of the taking of Luz or Lutz there in Judges chapter 1. So you have some interesting things here. Actually, I'm just gonna give you these. I don't have these listed here for you. So dealing with this allusion. So the first thing, I'm going to give you three things to consider here. First, when an offer is made to the man who is leaving the city of Luz to treat him with kindness if he showed them the entrance to the city, and of course to treat him with chesed, right? The wording is very similar there to the offer that was also made to Rahab, who helped the spies there, and they offered chesed to her as well. So you have similar language there as they go in, the offer that is made to this man and also to Rahab if he would help. Secondly, after Luz was struck by the sword, as was Jericho, you see that language there with cherev, the sword, struck with the sword. There in Judges 1:25 and also in Joshua 6:23, you see that the man and his family there in Luz are sent away, according to Judges 1:25, using terminology much like that of the bringing out of Rahab and her family in Joshua 6:23. Kind of interesting. The man of Luz builds a city. He builds a new city called Luz, right? Which remains until this day, ad hayom hazeh, according to Judges 1:26, which is terminology again identical to Joshua 6:25, where it said that Rahab lived with Israel ad hayom hazeh, until this day. Thirdly, there's not only the parallels, but it's the contrast. Oftentimes, when you have parallel, passages and allusions to previous passages, often the contrast that are the most striking things to note. And so there is a contrast between the two conquests here. So Rahab lived among the Israelites until her death, according to the text, as she, of course, confessed faith in Yahweh, the God of Israel, according to Joshua 2:9-11. Now, by contrast here, the man from Luz built a new city named Luz, which survives until this day. In fact, he makes no confession of faith to Israel as Rahab did prior. And so a covenant implying agreement involving chesed with him may have violated God's command to the nation not to make such covenants with the Canaanites, according to Deuteronomy 7. So the city of Luz lived on, and its new founder did not express faith in Yahweh, at least anything that we can see in the text. And so Joseph's victory over the first Luz rings hollow, if you will, when compared with Joshua's victory over Jericho. Secondly, I want to talk about the allusion to the spies that are sent out by Joshua in Joshua 2 in the narration of Dan's move to the north in Judges 18, there in the epilogue of Judges. So first thing to mention there, the place and number of men that are specified in each case, right? You see in Judges 18, 2 from Zorah and Eshtaol, 5 men. Joshua 2, 1 also mentions the specific number of men from Shittim. Second, the commands are given to each group of men, lexically similar there, as well in Judges 18:2 and Joshua 2:1. And then thirdly, we see the spies' journey. And this is an interesting thing here. It's the parallels, but the contrast. Also, by the way, these allusions and contrasts here are also going to further illustrate the downward spiral that's taking place, the moral anarchy and the downward trajectory that's taking place in the book of Judges in a short span, by the way, from Joshua's generation and the elders who outlived him to those who came after. But we see thirdly here, the spies' journey, it comes to a temporary halt at a named house owner in Judges 18:2. We see that in Joshua 2:1 as well. So a named house owner there where they spend the night. So the spies in both cases spend the night at someone's house. However, the spies of Jericho spend the night in the house of a Gentile woman, right, Rahab, who expresses faith in the God of Israel. Interestingly enough, while the Danite spies spend the night in the house of an Israelite, Micah, who actually practices idolatry. So In the case of Joshua, they spend the night in the house of a Gentile who expresses faith in Yahweh. In this case, the opposite. In the house of an Israelite, Micah, who is an idolater. So you have the hostess with the mostess, if you will. Rahab is then treated with loyalty, chesed, loving kindness there for her act, while the Danites actually send back 600 men and they steal Micah's idol, his idols, and his Levite. So the Danites actually show themselves to be idolatrous thieves in the text, while the spies under Joshua are faithful to their word. So there's quite the contrast there in these allusions as well. And another one to look at here is the battle against Benjamin in Judges chapter 20 and the allusion to the battle against Ai in Joshua chapter 8. Now, this one's really interesting here in illustrating the progression here. So I want to give some parallels and then a couple of contrasts on this one. So I'll spend a little more time on this one here. So starting off with some of the parallels here, the first thing there, both of these battles, if you recall the narratives, both in Joshua 8, as they go against Ai, and in Judges, both battles feature an ambush, right, against the enemy after an initial failure. So in the case of Ai, they are initially defeated by them, and then they go back again a second time. We have success the second time around. In the battle against Ai, they lay ambush in that second battle. The same thing happens there in Judges 20 as the Israelites, battle their own countryman, Benjamin, there. And in fact, in both cases, so you have both battles featuring an ambush against the enemy after an initial failure, or failures in the one case, multiple failures. In both cases, the cities are set on fire to signal to those who are pretending to flee to turn back, right, and to fight, and thus trapping the enemy, right? So they ambush them. And those hidden in ambush would then fight with those who pretend to flee and who turned around. And so the inhabitants are then annihilated in both cases. And so you had the same basic plot that is repeated there in Joshua 8 and the defeat of Ai, and in Joshua 20 and the defeat of Benjamin. So secondly, and that was kind of a couple things for the first point there, so it's quite a few things. But secondly, broadly speaking, you have repeated vocabulary in the two accounts throughout, from yatzah, to go out, and to meet, from kara, the term to meet there, in Joshua 8 and Judges 20. And it's only in these texts is the particular sequence of going out to meet used in parallel fashion. And so this perhaps may indicate a markedness between the two accounts in view of the fact that there are, of course, many battles in each book. And so it's very interesting once you start to see certain parallels and a repeated language between some of them. So thirdly, you've got further shared vocabulary from these two battles, to flee, the term noose, and so on, barishon, and so on. There's numerous terms that are used, the verb natach, to draw away. It does appear in Joshua 4:18, which is not the Ai narrative, but we see it repeated there in Joshua 8 several times, and in Judges 20, there in the war with Benjamin. And fourthly, both battle accounts reach a decisive moment, right? A climax there when the enemy turns around and they see their city on fire. And the terminology used in both cases is very particularly similar in Joshua 8:20 and in Judges 20 verse 40. So a lot of language repeated describing that moment there, that turning point. The fifth thing here, both of these conflicts, the battle in Joshua against Ai, the battle against Benjamin in Judges 20, both of these conflicts are preceded by an act that is described as folly, the Hebrew root there, naval, right? In both of these texts, we see that. So it's preceded by an act that is described as folly. So in Joshua 7:15, and in Judges 19:23 and 24, and in Judges 20 verses 6 and 10. Now, in the book of Judges, it refers to the sexual perversity of the men of Gibeah, while in Joshua, of course, it refers to Achan's violation of the ban. And then sixthly here, there does appear to be a parallel use of narrative heightening there in Joshua 8:20 and 21, and in Judges 20 verses 36 through 39, really through 41. And so the two narratives really share a similar plot. They share a lot of similar vocabulary. Not only that, they also share narrative technique. All of these things really comparing. And now I want to look at some contrast between these two particular narratives, these two battles here. So the first thing is a contrast. Now, again, the parallels and now the contrast really stick out. So the first contrast between these two battles is the victory against Ai is obviously celebrated by the nation, according to Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 through 35. But the victory over Benjamin is actually mourned in Judges chapter 21, since, of course, in this case, a tribe of their own is practically annihilated. And so they go from rejoicing to defeating their enemies. In the first case, in this case, they mourn, they weep over the almost annihilation of their own countrymen. The next contrast here, the second one here, in one battle, there's one defeat followed by success after consulting the Lord. That's what we see there in Joshua 8. So there's the initial defeat there because of the violation of the ban by Achan. Joshua consults the Lord. He says, what are you doing? Get up. There's sin in the camp. Go clean house, right? By the way, that's what we ought to be doing as ministers serving in our churches, right? This idea of discipline, right? Removing sin from the camp. By the way, sin is a reproach to any people, as scripture tells us elsewhere. And this is one of those object lessons I think we see here in Joshua 8. But you had the violation of the ban. And so Joshua's told to get up. What are you doing? Go remove the sin from the camp. He does that. And of course, they then have the victory over Ai. But what we see here is there's one defeat, in this case, followed by success after consulting the Lord. However, in the book of Judges, what we see again, we're seeing that this downward trajectory, this spiraling here in the book of Judges. We're kind of going from bad to worse, if you will. So in the case of Judges, there are actually two defeats after consulting the Lord before victory comes in that case. So the next contrast there is rather the obvious one here. The difference between battling the Canaanites, right? Their enemies as the Canaanites, there in the book of Joshua, and in the case of Judges here, they are battling their own brother Benjamin in a civil war. And so this creates quite the irony here in the book of Judges here. Others have noted, right? 12,000 Aites were spared at Ai, but not, and so, excuse me, 12,000 Aites were killed. I'm sorry, and in fact, what we see is 12,000 Aites are killed, and we see double that. 25,000 Benjamites are described as being killed. And that's warriors alone in the book of Judges. So we see more than double of their own countrymen lost in the battle there in Judges as compared to the Canaanites that were lost in the battle of Ai. Not only that, so it's twice as many, at least, it's more than twice as many Benjamites that are lost in the Civil War. But we also see that the livestock, we see that other plunder were spared at Ai. But when you read Judges there, that's not the case. They weren't spared there. So it's really interesting here as you read the narrative here in Judges here and the Civil War battle and its comparison and contrast to their battle against Ai, for example. So you could ask the question here, as others have suggested here, were the Israelites treating their brothers with excessive cruelty, as some have suggested, in comparison to how they treated some of the Canaanites that they battled against? Or perhaps we could ask the question, was the Lord judging them more harshly than the Canaanites themselves, as if to declare they had corrupted themselves beyond what the Canaanites had done? So some interesting questions as you look at these parallels. So, but anyways, as we look at these parallels here between Joshua and Judges, they appear to be undoubtedly deliberate here with Judges. But the important point to observe is the deterioration, the deterioration that I mentioned already in the spiritual state of the nation from one era to another. And again, this happens quite rapidly here. So the effect of the placement of the events that unfold in Judges with Joshua is to elevate the stature of Joshua as a leader who effects service to the Lord in Israel, according to Joshua 24:31, right? As opposed to the moral anarchy, the moral chaos that we see in Judges, where everyone followed their own instincts, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, which we see that added refrain there in Judges 17:6 and 21:25. So just as Joshua repeats the deeds of Moses in the book of Joshua, which we looked at last week, so Israel appears to repeat the deeds of Joshua in the book of Judges. However, there are some distinctions here. Israel's attempt in Judges is cast in a very negative light, as opposed to that with Joshua. So to this can also be added the observation that the moral anarchy, the moral chaos in Judges is attributed to the absence of a king. Right? It's attributed to the absence of a king there in Judges 17:6, Judges 18:1, Judges 19:1, and Judges 21 verses 25. So after the narrations there of the judges there in the final 5 chapters, we have 4 times that statement that there was no king in Israel, twice adding that refrain, as I mentioned, in 17:6 and 21:25, that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So again, Joshua apparently represents a kingly leader who can produce obedience, who can effect obedience among the people. And such a conclusion seems to be consistent with his portrayal in the really these royal overtones, if you will, there in Joshua chapter 1 with him. All right, so let's see. All right, so real quick, I want to provide a little bit of just basic, just kind of setting here, the period of the judges there. If we take the text straightforwardly, which I do, and I take an early date for the Exodus here, as you see that at the beginning of the timeline there, taking it from the Exodus all the way to the end of the divided kingdom there. But I take a date for the Exodus around 1446. So mid 15th century, as opposed to the late date in the mid 13th century, as other scholars do. But again, of course, we can come to that date with 1 Kings 6:1, for example, which talks about in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, the building of the temple there. So you can extrapolate, and it gives the exact amount of years. So you go back to you can do the math, and so it goes to 1446. But anyways, there are other things as well. The conquest of the land around 1400, say 1406, but I was rounding it to 1400 BC. And then, of course, we have the monarchy, which begins with the reign of Saul in 1050 BC. He reigned for 40 years, so from 1050 to 1010 BC. So the period of the judges would then necessarily fall, right, from after 1400 BC, and it would end in 1050 BC. As I mentioned, where Samuel, the last of the judges, who was also a prophet, anointed King Saul and ushered in the monarchy. So the period of the judges, again, you had the elders who outlived Joshua, so after 1400. So it's after 1400, so between 300 and 350 years there, right, leading up to the monarchy beginning with Saul. So that's the period of the judges. So between 1400 and 1050 BC, roughly speaking. I think a little bit more of a solid end date there, of course, with the rule of Saul that begins. Of course, David, anointed by Samuel as well, reigns from 1010 to 970 or 971, depending how you want to date that. And of course, Solomon, his son, reigns there 970 to 931 BC. And of course, the building of the temple there and the dedication of the temple under Solomon there in roughly 966 BC. And then, of course, after Solomon's death, we have Rehoboam, who rejects the counsel of the wise men, and he listens to his yes men, right? Good lesson there not to do that, right? And of course, we had the dividing of the kingdom there, and Jeroboam takes, the 10 tribes to the north go Jeroboam, and we've got the 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, who remain there. And so we have now Israel and Judah, this divided kingdom. Of course, if you guys recall, none of the kings of the northern kingdom were good. They were all wicked. And we had some good kings in the south there. For example, Josiah. You could put Hezekiah in there. and so on. So we did have some kings that are, and of course it's interesting, their rules are compared with the standard, that is the rule of David. So that's kind of your basic timeline there, kind of placing the period of the judges there after the conquest of the land, after the passing of the elders who outlived Joshua, and then of course ending there with the establishment of the monarchy. Any questions on that? Okay. So if all the years cited in the book of Judges are simply added up, the total comes up to a little over 400 years. So if one presumes then an early Exodus date, as I do in 1446 BC, resulting in a date of around 1400 for the conquest by Joshua, the amount of time then, as I've already noted here for you, between the conquest and Saul's reign, beginning in 1050, is of course around 350 years. So this is based on, again, on a straightforward interpretation of 1 Kings 6:1, as I mentioned, which states that Solomon began building the temple 480 years following Israel's exodus from Egypt. So you can do the math there. So presumably then, many of the 40-year periods of rest that we see in Judges, for example, in Judges 3:11, 5:31, 8:28, right? So we got many of the 40-year periods or even 80-year sequence there appear to overlap at times here in the book of Judges. The lack of rest, for example, after chapter 8 might also lend further support of the idea of overlaps of time between some of the material following that chapter and that before that chapter, and that is chapter 8 I'm referring to. So at the same time, it also highlights the descent of the nation from periods of deliverance and rest to the point where there is no rest. And it's going to be an interesting transition within the book of Judges itself. Again, note the promise of rest that was given all the way back in Deuteronomy 12:10, for example, Deuteronomy 25:19, fulfilled presumably in Joshua 21:44 and 23:1. So Judges, the book of Judges really traces this increasing oppression between the periods of rest until rest is actually completely absent from the book of Judges. And so we'll see that literarily, that development within the book of Judges there. Archer, for example, notes that an overlap of judgeships between Samson and Jephthah could be implied by Judges 10:7. That's one possibility right there, where Israel is sold into the hand of the Philistines and the sons of Ammon. So there's a number of things there. Let's see here. So as we talk about the structure of Judges here, I'm going to go ahead and put this up here for you guys, kind of this chiastic structure there. And so you'll notice again, I mentioned the prologue and the epilogue there, the introduction or the and the ending there. But again, almost really in two parts there. And what you'll see is kind of the central core there, with beginning in chapter 3 through the end of chapter 16 there, dealing with the narratives concerning the judges. The first judge, Othniel, to the last one there, Samson there. And so again, these narratives are framed with the prologue and the epilogue there. And so it's also important there. It's also interesting as you look at the kind of climax there, this chiastic structure there, with the judgeship of Gideon. And there are some interesting transitions that take place from that point in the book on. And so very interesting. So most scholars do agree that three principal main divisions can be discerned within the book of Judges. So again, mentioning the introduction there, the body there, and the epilogue there. Again, I mentioned the final division consisting of chapters 17 through 21 mention no judges, right? And this is going to transition us quite nicely into the book of Samuel, by the way. So there's no judges mentioned there, and there's this repeated refrain that's anticipating the future monarchy, right? Because the text is about there was no king in those days, which, by the way, it's an interesting statement there for the timing of when that was written, by the way. There was no king, so it apparently seems to be from, at least from the period of the monarchy, perhaps the divided kingdom, when such a conclusion to the book was made. So, of course, it would have to be after the period of the judges there for this and looking back on this. So that's one of the clues, for example, there that we see. So, again, not coincidentally, these last 5 chapters precede the book of Samuel, where the monarchy is, of course, established. And the first 2 chapters, by the way, of Samuel repeat material, of Judges repeat material from Joshua, which is, of course, the immediately preceding book. I mentioned some of that stuff already. So clearly the book of Judges was composed in a way that meshed, quite frankly, very nicely with these canonical texts surrounding, with the book of Joshua that precedes it and the book of Samuel that follows. So one begins to see really a merging, if you will, of identity between the chronicler and the compiler of individual books here, with the seamless transitions here, not only historically, but literarily between Joshua and Judges, really from the Torah to Joshua, from Joshua to Judges, from Judges right into Samuel there. So looking at this chiastic structure here of the book of Judges there. So I want to start with, I'm going to start with the body, dealing with the narratives with the judges there. So beginning with Othniel, and you'll see the parallel there with the narratives of Samson there. And then we'll look at Ehud and Shamgar there, with Jephthah, with Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, and then with Deborah, Barak, and Yael, with Abimelech, Tola, and Yair, and then, of course, the central portion of Gideon. And then we'll come back and take a brief look at the introduction and the epilogue there. So I'm just going to kind of hit some of these points and discuss some of this here for you guys. So the first individual that's mentioned in this core group, of course, is Othniel, mentioned in Judges 3, verses 7 through 11. And I'm just going to read the introduction and this with the Othniel here. It says, so the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baalim, right, the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord, it took them 8 years to cry out, apparently. When the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel, who delivered them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest. By the way, that's a theme, an idea that we see all the way back in Genesis 2. That's a theme we see throughout the Torah, and that anticipation of God desiring to bring his people into rest. And this is something that there's a struggle, this tension in Judges, by the way, due to the people's disobedience. But he raises up a deliverer, and there was rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died, right? So we've got the first individual in this core group, Othniel, who does not follow the pattern of intermarriage with Gentile women, which is described in the immediately preceding verses. I didn't read verses 5 and 6, for example. So in verse 5, and again, they were commanded not to take foreign wives, right? In order that they would not follow after their gods, commit idolatry, right? So it says in verse 5, thus the sons of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods as a result, right? Exactly what the Torah had commanded for them not to do, they have done. And so Othniel is one who has not followed in that pattern. God raises him up as a judge to judge the people and to deliver the people and to give rest to the people there in the land. So Othniel does not follow the pattern of intermarriage with these Gentile women, these pagans, and thus fall into idolatry. And so he is distinguished from the nation here in the text. So his wife pressed him to ask for more land and asked more from her father Caleb. according to verses 14 and 15, just a little further down. Samson, right? It's very interesting here. You guys can kind of see where this is going, hopefully. Samson, who is contrasted with Othniel, right? Within this outline, right? He seeks out Philistine women. He seeks out Gentile women who bring him into their territory, and he finally becomes their prisoner before he dies, right? So no deliverance is attained, and he himself loses his life as a captive of the Philistines, these Gentiles there. So a contrast is created here between these two judges. One scholar noted this way, quote, Othniel's wife is the secret of his success, while Samson's women, plural, remember Proverbs says not to seek out women, plural, right? But Othniel's wife is the secret of his success, while Samson's women, the secret of his downfall, end quote. So do want to note also against this structure, right, that Othniel's wife is only mentioned in the introduction, a location which does not parallel structurally the Samson narrative, but nonetheless, these ideas are present there. This sequence of judges, starting with success, here with Othniel, for example, and ending in failure across chapters 3 through 15. Starts with success with Othniel, it ends with failure in Samson. And in some sense, there's kind of that victory there, of course, that he took out more people in his death than his life there. But clearly, Samson presented in a negative light there, and man, we see this trend in the book of Judges. And so this beginning with success, ending in failure across chapters 3 through 15 is foreshadowed in Judges chapter 1 already. The readers prepared for such a progression in the book. So the order followed in Judges 1 of the tribal conquest, or the lack thereof the tribal conquest, begins with successful Judah, or Othniel from Judah there in Judges 1. Verses 1 through 15, and it ends with unsuccessful Dan in 134. And between them, we see Benjamin, Joseph, Ephraim, Zebulun, and so on. We see the various tribes who mostly fail to drive out the Canaanites according to the text. Likewise, we see here successful Othniel in chapter 3 is followed by judges of increasingly doubtful behavior. Questionable behavior. So especially after Gideon, and in fact with Gideon as well, but especially after Gideon, and of course ending in Samson, who is none other than the Danite, right? And so again, beginning with Judah, Othniel, and ending with Samson, the Danite, again following the pattern there of Judges chapter 1 in that regard. So the move is from the south, Judah, to the north, Dan, in each case. Again, keep in mind, even if Samson the Danite lives in the middle western territory bordering on the Philistines, right, his tribe eventually moves to the north, as chapter 18 reveals for the reader. So here again, Judah represents the ideal, while Dan and eventually Benjamin represents much less. So there's a preparation here in the book of Judges for what follows with the Judahite, right? David from the tribe of Judah, and Saul, who is from the tribe of Benjamin, in the following book of Samuel. And so we're going to start to see these preparations even here in the book of Judges. So I'm going to move on here to D there with Ehud in the contrast with Jephthah there. So Ehud announces a message from God to the king of Moab. Right, so they're in 3:19 and 20. So he eventually sends, all right, the root there, shalach, he eventually sends his hand to his knife in order to slay Eglon. Right, so the corresponding narrative is, of course, is of Jephthah, the judge there. Jephthah also sends shalach there in chapter 11, messengers twice to the king of Ammon, and his messengers recount the fate of Moab's king. Again, the ensuing battle there in chapter 3 takes place at the fords of the Jordan, according to chapter 3, verse 28. So this battle takes place at the fords of the Jordan with Moab. The enemy of Israel there is defeated. Another battle takes place at those same fords in chapter 12, verses 5 and 6. But this time, again, this parallel and contrast, this time it's just the same location, but it's between fellow Israelites in a civil war, Gilead versus Ephraim. Just as between Othniel and Samson, which we looked at, things had deteriorated between Ehud and Jephthah. So this pattern of bad to worse, if you will, seems to be announced already as early as chapter 2, verse 19, which I read just a bit ago, for the history of these judges there. So with Samson, the situation reaches the point, in fact, where Judahites treacherously bind him. They turn him over to the Philistines in chapter 15. And so Judah is the exemplary tribe in chapter 1, and from which the ideal judge, Othniel, comes from. But now they ask Samson, in fact, if he does not know that the Philistines rule over them. So clearly at this point, by the end of this central narrative there, they've accepted this life of bondage for themselves, and they don't even recognize the judge sent to deliver them. Also, as you look at Deborah, Barak, and Yael with Abimelech there, you have so E and E there looking at. So there's war with an enemy of Israel that's carried out in chapters 4 and 5. So we've got the narrative and the poetry there by the war, of course, with Deborah and Barak. And the commander is finally killed by a woman, Yael. You guys love this passage. That's the kind of woman of God you need, right? The kind of woman who's going to drive a tent peg through the skull of the enemy. That's the woman of God I want, right? And so some of you guys are thinking, yeah, my wife goes hunting with me. So, but you see this battle that's carried out with an enemy of Israel there in Judges 4 and 5 with Deborah and Barak. The commander of the enemy is finally killed by the woman Yael, who pierces his head with a tent peg there, according to 4:21. Then Yael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went down into the ground. Wow, what a detail. All the way through his head. For he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. So you had this woman who kills the commander, this enemy of Israel. So he dies by the hands of a woman with a blow to the head. Well, in the case of Abimelech as well, a woman smashes his head with a millstone. But this time in Judges chapter 9, guess what? It's in a civil war once again. So that's Judges 9, verses 53 and 54. So in the first instance there, in the first war, right, an enemy commander is killed. While in the second case here, it's an Israelite leader, even though, of course, the Israelite leader is of a dubious character, shall we say. So in each case, we have the death at the hands of a woman by a blow to the head brings the story to a climax here. So clearly we have the parallels and contrasts here. Again, this idea of bad to worse, Israel battling their enemies, and now their enemies are their own countrymen as the progression goes forward here in the book of Judges. Now I want to look at the central portion there, the climax there in section F, the narrative dealing with the judge Gideon. So Gideon, who is of Manasseh, by the way, he starts off really good. If you guys recall in chapter 6, he starts off by destroying an idol and defeating the enemy, according to chapter 6 and 7, right? And it starts off, and the Lord visits him, and do not be afraid. The angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." Or this is the description of him. Gideon said to him, "Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us?" And so on. And he calls him, right? And he calls these men, they go to battle. Gideon starts off well, destroying idols and so on. But there's an interesting progression now that takes place not only in the book, but within the very life of Gideon himself. At the central portion of the book of Judges, we see a transition there. So he begins by destroying an idol, for example, and defeating the enemy, according to chapters 6 and 7. And in fact, this one Gideon who begins by destroying the idol and defeating the enemy actually becomes idolatrous himself, according to chapter 8, verse 27. And in chapter 8, verse 27, we see that they've gathered gold there. And of course, then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. So he started off well, didn't finish so well, by the way. So he becomes idolatrous himself and nearly takes part in another civil war with the Ephraimites in chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. So, and in fact, and this is before destroying his own countrymen at Sukkot and Penuel, according to chapter 8, verses 13 through 17. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle from the ascent of Heres. And he caught a young man of the men of Sukkot and interrogated him. And he wrote down for him the leaders of Sukkot and its leaders and its elders, 77 men. Then he came to the men of Sukkot and said, Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men? And he took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Sukkot. Then he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Just an example there, right? Now, Gideon's own descent, right? After really right here at the center, the heart of the book, it really typifies that of the general decline of the whole nation. Gideon is a kind of a microcosm of what's happening with the nation, this leader Gideon, right here at the heart of the book, the central portion of the book. So after he uses the gold, which was collected to make an idol, according to chapter 8, which, by the way, what does that remind you of? Immediately, that ought to remind us of Aaron the priest, gathering the gold there at Mount Sinai and the idolatry when they fashioned the golden calf. And here again, gathering the gold and setting up an idol here. So we have his own descent right here at the heart of the book. Again, a microcosm, it really typifies the life of the nation as a whole. And so after he uses the gold that was collected to make an idol in chapter 8, verses 25 through 27, I begin verse 25. So they answered, we will gladly give them, right? Talk about the gold. Verse 20. Well, I'll go back to verse 24. Then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you that each of you would give me the earrings from his plunder, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. So they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out a garment, and each man threw into it the earrings from his plunder. Now the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes, which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. Then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. So there's the description of this decline of Gideon right here within his own life and leadership there of the nation. And again, typifying that life of the nation as a whole. And so after he uses the gold that he collected to make this idol, his son is given money from the temple of Baal Berit, right? The Baal of the covenant there, to raise an army, according to chapter 9, verse 4. So they gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal Berit, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. So they then, we see, he makes the idol, the gold. His son is given money from the temple of Baal Berit to raise an army. Now, incidentally, right, this God, Baal of the covenant, is the one that Israel takes as its God, according to chapter 8, verse 33. Anticipating, by the way, literally, the use of funds from his temple that we're going to see there in chapter 9. So they use the funds from the temple of Baal Berit to raise up an army. So their covenant, right, the Hebrew term Berit, is with a false God, in spite of the prohibition that's given against such covenants being made. As we see that back in chapter 2, verse 2, for example, these covenants, the prohibition against such covenants being made with those in the land, much less with their gods, making covenants with their gods. So the accusation all the way back in Judges chapter 2, verse 2, for example, by Yahweh, that they have made such covenants, is explicitly demonstrated now here in chapters 8 and 9. So another sign of decline across the series of Judges, beginning really with the programmatic cycle back in chapter 2, verse 18, where we read that the Lord was with the judge, right? Back then in chapter 2. Such a situation was true with Gideon, right? Who was addressed, as I mentioned already, by the angel or the messenger of the Lord, right? With the words, "The Lord is with you," according to chapter 6, verse 12. Samson, for example, also clearly shows evidence of Yahweh's presence in his life. But of course, his mixing with the Canaanite women results finally in Yahweh leaving him, right? And of course, you guys remember very vividly that Samson was not even aware of it, right? Where it says, but he did not know that Yahweh had left him. Literally, it says, departed from upon him there in chapter 16. So furthermore, the phrase that's repeated, and the land had rest for X amount of years. Now, I want you to notice this pattern as well. We had this repeated phrase in the opening sections there of the narratives of the judges. So this phrase, and the land had rest for X amount of years, whether it was 40 or whatever the number was, the land had rest for X amount of years. It's found, for example, in chapter 3, verse 11, chapter 3, verse 30, chapter 5, verse 31, chapter 8, verse 28. It even mentions that after Gideon's victory. But never again is that mentioned in the book. There are no more references to rest in the land after the rulership of Gideon. So we have those direct references to rest in the land in that cycle that you see that people have spoken of, this cycle that takes place in Judges. But that cycle breaks down literally after the midpoint here. So there is no more rest for the land after Gideon. And what's interesting here, by the way, not only that, so that's one of the things that progresses literarily in the book, but Gideon himself, interestingly enough, refuses kingship when he's offered in chapter 8. So beginning there in verse 22, after the victory there, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." That sounds great and all, but it seems to be a little bit disingenuous, as we're going to see with Gideon, right? In fact, his son takes it by force and by the murder of his brothers, as we see in the opening verses of chapter 9. And you could really add to this, you really wonder as to Gideon's sincerity in such a statement here, right? Because his son's name is what? Abimelech. What does his son's name mean? Literally, my father is king. So Gideon named his son, "My father is king." So you can see the irony here, and perhaps the statement here in the rejection by Gideon. But we see his idolatry that takes place here in the book. And so really the central portion and the lack of rest that follows here, that pattern breaks down here after Gideon. So I want to look at the introduction and the epilogue here. So the beginning and the close, the bookends of Judges. So really some divide up the introduction into two parts and the epilogue into two parts. And so you've got the mention of Joshua's death in 1:1 and his sending the people away in 2:6 as borders around the introduction's major divisions there. On the other hand, the second mention of his death in 2:21 could also mark an inclusio around the whole of chapters 1 and 2. For the final chapters, 17 through 21, it is clear that they are marked off by the repeated refrain, as I've mentioned already. Quote, "In those days there was no king in Israel," and they add a refrain there. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You see that in 17:6 and in 21:25. So half of that refrain, "there was no king in Israel," is repeated there in 18:1 and 19:1 as well. So those are clear indicators of division within the narrative there in the final chapters. Most pointed parallel between the introduction and the final chapter and the final chapters or the final narratives there is that question that is asked by Israel, interestingly enough, where they ask in Judges 1:1, "Who will go up for us first in battle?" That question is asked once again in chapter 20, verse 18. Who will go up for us in battle, first in battle? So Israel is fighting the Canaanites again in chapter 1, verse 1, and they receive an answer from Yahweh that which tribe will lead them? Judah. Judah is the ideal tribe for leadership, according to the text here. And so, again, we see there in, so Judah is the one who will go up first, while in chapter 20, verse 18, they are warring against, again, civil war against Benjamin, their own countrymen. And again, it is Judah that is commanded to go up first. So here we see once again the deterioration from war against Canaanites in the first half of Judges to civil war in the second half of the book of Judges. The fact that Israel, led by Judah, is to war against Benjamin, get this, is a harbinger of David's battle against the house of Saul, the Benjamite, in the book of Samuel. Now keep in mind, David refuses to raise a hand against Saul, for he is the Lord's anointed. But we're already starting to see Judah presented as the ideal tribe for leadership, and Benjamin presented in the most negative light in the narratives in the book of Judges here. So there's also, again, as mentioned before, this contrast between Othniel, who's a Judahite, there in chapter 1, who gains a wife by defeating the Canaanites, and the contrast between him and the Benjamites, who get their wives after a civil war, and the further slaughtering of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead in chapter 21. So even the Benjamites had to take them by force, again, with the tacit permission of Israel's elders and against the wishes of their fathers and their brothers there at Shiloh. So Jerusalem is defeated by Judah in chapter 1, verse 8, but Benjamin is unable to possess it fully, and so the Jebusites remain there in the land. So later on in chapter 19, a Levite and his concubine, they actually bypassed Jerusalem to avoid the Jebusites, of all things. Maybe they would have received better treatment in the Jebusite territory, right? Because they go on and they are treated horribly by the Benjamites. She's raped to death by the Sodomites of Gibeah. And so Benjamin, again, is clearly characterized in the negative light, there, of course, contrasted with Judah. We see Israel weeps before Yahweh, as I mentioned back in chapter 2, at a national assembly, presumably at the news given to them that they would not be able to drive out the Canaanites who oppressed them. Now, again, here, the nation weeps before Yahweh in chapter 20 at another national assembly over the fact this time that they cannot defeat Benjamin in a civil war. So, again, at the risk of being repetitive here, it is notable the irony of the war of Israelites against Canaanites in the first half of the book of Judges versus civil war that takes place in the second half of the book of Judges. Also, compare the first two episodes of the epilogue there, 17:1 through 18:31, with the overview that's given in the introduction there, 2:6 through 3:6. Now, in the latter here, the generations after that of Joshua, they degenerate according to chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. And God leaves the nations in the land to see if they would obey the commandments by Moses, according to 3:4. Now, in chapter 17, verses 1 through 5, we read of a woman who dedicates silver originally stolen from her by her own son for the making of an idol, and this son owns a special house for his idols. He then consecrates one of his own sons as a priest. Now, this is very interesting here. The degeneration of these generations is clearly proceeding here. Later on, we read how the grandson of Moses himself in Judges 18:30 becomes priest of the same idol there at Dan. So not only the Ephraimites in chapter 17, but also Moses' own descendants in chapter 18, verse 30, they lapse into idolatry in just the span of a few short years. This is remarkable. So we see also how this Levite will sell himself to the highest bidder, if you will, and serve at an idolatrous shrine also. So we've got a number of interesting things going on here in the structure of Judges here. Some further evidence of a literary unity here in the book of Judges to mention here. So another hint of the downward trend throughout Judges is the pattern that's outlined back at the beginning there, setting the stage in chapter 2, beginning in verse 11. And I want to read this here, this pattern that scholars have noted But again, of course, the breakdown of that pattern. So go ahead and read beginning chapter 2, verse 11, if you want to follow along. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass, when the judge was dead, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. And so you see this pattern there that's mentioned there. So, and really, this cycle again is not repeated fully in all of the accounts. And so, so one version of the cycle is as follows. Number one, if you want to jot this down. Number one, Israel does what is evil in Yahweh's sight. Israel does what is evil in Yahweh's sight. That's first. Secondly, Yahweh gives or sells the people into the hand of oppressors. Yahweh gives or sells the people into the hand of the oppressors. So number one, Israel does what is evil in Yahweh's sight. Number two, Yahweh then gives or sells the people into the hand of the oppressors. Number three, Israel then cries out to Yahweh. So Israel cries out to Yahweh. Number four, Yahweh raises up a deliverer. So Israel does what is evil in Yahweh's sight. Then Yahweh gives or sells the people into the hand of the oppressors. Then Israel cries out to Yahweh, number three. And then number four, Yahweh raises up a deliverer. He hears them. He raises up a deliverer. Then number five, what happens? The deliverer defeats the oppressor, right? And then number six, the land has rest. And that's the general pattern, though not all those components are expressly stated in every case. So as mentioned already, the land apparently does not enjoy rest after the narrative concerning Gideon. And that's an important transition there. So in the case of Samson, in fact, there is no cry to Yahweh. Even after the 40 years of serving the Philistines, it mentions no cry out to Yahweh there. So, of course, Samson is delivered to the oppressor instead of defeating the oppressor. And as other judges had done. So the pattern breaks down, again, mirroring the moral decline, the moral anarchy that takes place in the book of Judges there. Just as the moral decline is spelled out, even literarily, we see that breakdown as well, as there is no rest for the land, for God's people there. All right. Again, last week I had mentioned with Judges there a number of things there just to remind you of. So I wanted to at least cover some of the big picture stuff here, but I do want to conclude with a few things here about the exaltation of Judah here in the book of Judges here. So I want to give some final discussion to this here. So I already noted how Othniel, right? He's from the tribe of Judah. He's characterized as an ideal judge. And the worst example is, of course, Samson is of Dan, a tribe that eventually settled in the north. Now, in addition to that, the tribe of Judah is accorded leadership status by Yahweh in battles against either Canaanites or Benjamin, right? Who's going to go up for us first to lead us? It's Judah in both cases there. whether it's against the Canaanites or against their own countrymen. So Judah begins the book designated as the leader. And the book concludes with the statement that without a king, the nation lived in this anarchical state, this rebellious state there. So the implication, by the way, is that a king was needed. And in fact, 4 times stating there in chapter 17 through 21 that there was no king in Israel, hence anticipating a king, and that when this king would come, that he would come from the tribe of Judah. So there is, again, this implication a king was needed, and Judah was the candidate for leadership. So this tribe was also chosen, again, to lead the tribes away from Sinai in Numbers, right there in the Torah. And so was destined for kingship. Also, according to, guys, we already know this, that the tribe of Judah was destined for kingship according to Genesis 49, there in the Torah, right, through whom this Messianic king would come. And according to Selhammer, for example, I'll give you a quote from him, quote, Judah has begun to replace Joshua as God's leader. So we see this transition now, me talking here, we see this transition from Moses to Joshua, right, as the leader, this prophet in the mold of Moses there. And now we see this and this eschatological figure. Now we see this transition of leadership from Joshua to the tribe of Judah here again, which is already anticipated in the Torah. And so Selhammer states here, go back to the quote here, Judah has begun to replace Joshua as God's leader. So that I think is clearly the case here in the book of Judges. Now, supporting this fact is the fact that the previous book opens with a divine command to Joshua, the individual, to conquer the land. And now Judges begins the same way, right? Judges opens with a divine command for Judah to do the same. Again, paralleling them, right? Now taking over the leadership that Joshua had is now being handed to the tribe of Judah. So, so we might understand that the eschatological portrayal of Joshua, which we already saw in the previous book and discussed last week, can now be seen as a prefigurement, if you will, of one who will eventually come from the tribe of Judah. And again, we have formal similarities of the promises that are made to Joshua in Joshua chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, that are also made to Judah there in Judges chapter 1, verses 2 and 4 in particular. Also note here in chapter 1, notes how Judah's victories, in Judges chapter 1, notes how Judah's victories are extensive, including the Canaanites, the Perizzites, Adonai-Bezek, a king who subjugated 70 other monarchs, by the way, in verse 7, Jerusalem, verse 8, the mountains, the Negev, the Shephelah, in verse 9. In Joshua 10 and Joshua 12, Joshua, in particular, Joshua 10:40 and Joshua 12:8, Joshua is credited with conquering these 3 regions of the land, but now Judah is the one here in Judges. Judah goes on to conquer Hebron and its 3 giants in verse 10, whereas in Joshua 15:14, this deed is attributed to Caleb. Now, granted, Caleb is of Judah, but the difference is revealing about the narrator's intention here in Judges. So when he desires to repeat material verbatim, he is capable of it, and he shows that this repetition from Joshua to Judges, as for example between Joshua 15 verses 15 through 19 and Judges 1 verses 11 through 15. So you see that the story of Achsah, Othniel, and Caleb. So there in verse 16 we read of the Kenites joining Judah, as did Simeon in verse 3, and then Simeon is forgotten in verses 4 and following when the conquests are related. So later on, we see how Yael, the wife of Heber, the Kenite slaves Sisera, the commander there, which we mentioned already. And furthermore, the Kenites are relatives of Moses by marriage, according to chapter 1, verse 16. So as a result, really the image portrayed of these people is positive as they join Judah, in contrast to Moses' own grandson, as I mentioned already in chapter 18, who joins the Danites in idolatry. So in chapter 1, verse 18, Judah conquers Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, and the hill country. But in Joshua 10:41, Joshua himself is credited with the conquest of Gaza and surrounding areas. So clearly the parallels of Joshua and the tribe of Judah for leadership. The first mention of Benjamin emphasizes really their inability to dispossess the Jebusites from Jerusalem, as I mentioned already in Judges 1:21. while we just read prior to that Judah's victories against that city in verse 8. So this victory of Judah seems to contradict the statement of Joshua 15:63 directly, where they failed to do the same. So apparently neither one was able to possess the city, as we see the following comparison there in Joshua 15:63, where it says Judah could not dispossess the Jebusites, but in Judges 1:21, it says Benjamin could not dispossess the Jebusites. But then in Judges 1:8, it tells us that Judah fought against Jerusalem, conquered, smote, and burned her with fire. Well, that's interesting there. So it should be noted that Jerusalem was granted to Judah there in Joshua 15:8 and 63, and to Benjamin in Joshua 18:16 and 28 there. So Jerusalem fell exactly on the border between these two tribes, Benjamin's southern tribe and Judah's northern side there. And so each could claim it for themselves, if you will. So apparently, neither tribe was able to completely dispossess this city, since David finally took it there in 2 Samuel 24:16 and 18. We'll also see that repeated. He took it in 2 Samuel 5 from the Jebusites. But again, later on, as we see later on, same, and even in the book of Kings, for example, in 1 Kings 9, talks how the Jebusites continued to live there. So we read that both Judah and Benjamin were unable to dispossess the Jebusites and to possess it for themselves. So interestingly enough, there is apparently a difference between conquering and smiting with the sword and burning it by Judah in Judges 1:8 and possessing it for themselves in Joshua 15:63. It uses different terminology, by the way. In the latter case, the verb is never used of Judah in Judges 1:8, where it talks about them possessing, not being able to possess it in Joshua 15. So it doesn't use that term. So another verb is used in Judges 1:17, denoting the utter destruction of Zaphat, and that is not used for Jerusalem throughout chapter 1, nor is it used in the immediately following verse 18 for Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron's destruction by Judah as well. So it does become evident that in Samuel that these Philistine cities were never effectively possessed by Israel. So consequently then, Jerusalem and the Philistine cities experienced attack, defeat, and conquest, but never become Israelite cities in every sense of the word. So one commentator, for example, opines the fact that the Jebusites were driven from the city, but later returned, while others interpret this as destruction of the city proper, but that the fortress of Zion never fell, and there the Jebusites escaped. So different ways of looking at that, but it's interesting there, the tension there. Note also Joshua 15:63 agrees with 2 Samuel 24:16 and 28 by stating that the Jebusites continued to live there with Judah in Jerusalem. The only difference apparently between Judah and Benjamin was that Judah caused much more damage to the city. In fact, we never read whether or not Benjamin even attacked Jerusalem explicitly there. Judah still is characterized in more favorable terms than Benjamin is, without sacrificing historical accuracy. And I think that's important here. The author is not willing to sacrifice historical accuracy in its presentation of these tribes. So the fact that David, again, who is a Judahite, later in Samuel does actually possess the city for himself, really what it does, it enhances David's stature in the light of these passages of Joshua and Judges. So David is going to be elevated in Samuel and what he accomplishes there. So the rest of chapter 1 relates Judah's conquest and how Yahweh was with him. But the list of the failures of Manasseh, for example, is extensive, as it is for Ephraim. Then Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, Dan are noted for their failures as well. So Judah is presented as exemplary among the tribes in Judges, conquering large areas of the land because God is with this tribe. God is with him. His failures are, quite frankly, only minimal, while those of the rest to the north are noted for their failures. So the writer really is laying groundwork for the anointing of David in the book of Samuel and the failure of his opponent Saul. David from the tribe of Judah and Saul, who is from the tribe of Benjamin. So I think for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and pause it here. Much more that can be said here from the book of Judges. We're going to take a brief break here in just a moment here. But at this point here, any comments or questions at this point before we take a quick break? So I'll just make a comment here real quick. Again, we're talking about the prophetic history of the nation playing out here. What is already indicated in the Torah, the commands not to go after foreign wives, idolatry, all that kind of stuff. We see that playing out here. The transition of leadership there from Moses to Joshua, now to Judah, is very evident here from the outset here. This progression from bad to worse, right? The idolatry and the life of the nation, the patterns within the literary structure of the book as well, the breakdown of that structure also further reinforces the moral decline of the nation there. And also at the end of the book of Judges there, the repeated references there to there was no king in Israel in those days, twice adding the refrain, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, clearly anticipating that a king is to come, and that when he comes, we already know from the Torah, right? Genesis 49, for example, and reinforced here in the book of Judges that he is going to come from Judah, the ideal king. He's going to come from Judah, the ideal tribe of leadership, which is contrasted with Benjamin. And again, of course, this prepares the reader for the book of Samuel, as we'll see. Saul, a Benjamite, David, a Judahite. So there's a lot of things going on here in Judges here, transitioning from the Torah and Joshua right into the period of Judges, and transitioning the reader to and anticipating the monarchy and God's work through his people there. So a lot of things going on here in Judges. But thoughts or comments or questions on that before break?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about whether or not you think that the Judges has something to say about the activity of God's Spirit with respect to the leadership of the judges. Because I know in part of our reading, one of the scholars that we read said that they thought that there was a sort of a general critique of charismatic leadership in Judges. And as I thought about that, I thought, well, I'm not sure that that's what's going on, but there may be the Judges may be trying to say something about the need for a qualitatively different activity of God's Spirit with respect to leadership. I mean, we think about, the description in Judges of the Spirit empowering Samson, for example, and just the fact that the empowering activity of God's Spirit doesn't ensure that Samson's going to lead in a godly way or is going to succeed in delivering Israel as a leader. And there, I wonder if you think there's some sort of commentary there about the need for something beyond a simply empowering ministry or empowering activity of God's Spirit with respect to the leadership of the nation, that there's a need for something transformative to happen. And whether or not that carries through into the way that God's Spirit, for example, departs from Saul, or the way that God's Spirit interacts with David. I'm just trying to figure out if there's really something significant in terms of the theme of Judges, and whether or not the author's trying to say something about the Holy Spirit, because that one scholar did raise that as an issue, and I thought, well, I'm not sure it's as simple as a critique of charismatic leadership.
I would concur that I don't think it's that simple. I don't think that's really, because what you just laid out there is the monarchy does not resolve that. And in fact, David himself in 2 Samuel 22 and 23 in particular, in that poetic scene there, that prayer, he concludes, this is what the righteous rule of Messiah looks like. And he's going to say, by the way, not so my house, right? I'm not the one, right? But his hope is secure in the promise that God has made. It is ordered in all things and secure, he says, right? So he's not ultimately, again, the answer, right? But there is one coming through the line of David, right? Through the house of David, who ultimately will be the answer to that. So in one sense, David is the answer to that, but David himself acknowledges that he's not the one, right? That he is anticipating. He is also hoping in God's promises, which do not fail, right? So again, keep in mind, Judges in the context of the Torah and Joshua, which precedes it, and the book of Samuel, which follows. It's sandwiched between this. And so we already know the anticipation is that of a king. It's looking to a king. So yes, there is going to be something changing, but is it just the empowerment aspect of leadership? I don't think that's the case. because there's failure even with the monarchy, right? As they are harbingers only of what is to come, right?
Right.
That is Messiah who comes through the line of David.
And
So I think
that's
David
kind of,
himself makes that point.
and that's kind of what I was getting at, is that there might be an idea here uh, of the need for something qualitatively different in regard to the activity of God's Spirit that doesn't actually fully change with the arrival of the monarchy. So yes, there's the need, this need of a king, but David recognizes he's not the king. In the same way, maybe there's this theme with respect to how God's Spirit interacts with his leader that in some
Not
ways
just his
changes with
leader.
the arrival of the Davidic
Yeah,
monarchy, but in some ways doesn't, and therefore consequently continues to point forward to the need for a new. And then you get into the prophets and you see things like, I'm going to pour out my Spirit. There's going to be a new activity of God's Spirit in the future.
yeah,
And
there
so
may
I'm
be
just trying to
something
figure out
to
if
that.
that's really there or if I'm stretching.
Well, there may be something to that because there is something qualitatively different, right? That is one of the distinguishing marks of the new covenant, right? Is the indwelling, the pouring out of the Spirit of God, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit in his people, as opposed to what we see prior. Right, so there is something different there, right? And so there might be something to that, and looking at how God's Spirit interaction works through not only the leaders, but the people of God, right? And so, in dealing with these covenants and working through the outworking of God's purposes in his people and the bringing about of the Messiah. And so, that's an interesting question there. I think what you said is probably a little bit better way to try to pursue looking at that as opposed to just a mere statement of, oh, well, this is just a critique of charismatic leadership. I think that might be reading modern day experiences back into it. Uh, so, other thoughts or comments to that? Good, Mark. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. No other thoughts or comments? Very well. We'll take a 6-minute break at 7:44. We'll pick it back up at 7:50, and we'll start into the book of Samuel. We'll keep moving here. All right, gentlemen. All right, gentlemen. Sorry about the delay there. All right, so am I sharing screen right now? Okay, well, I can do that here in just a moment here, but let me go ahead and get started here, and I'll get the shared screen going here. So I do want to get into the book of Samuel. So as we talk about the book of Samuel, of course, talk about its canonical location. So Ruth follows Proverbs in the Hebrew canon, right? So in the Hebrew canonical text, right, Judges is followed by Samuel instead of Ruth, as in modern English versions, which follow the Greek Alexandrian canon there. So it appears obvious that chronological reasons were behind the collection of Ruth after Judges, since it begins with the words, of course, and it came to pass, and it was when the judges were judging, right? That's how the book of Ruth begins. And so that follows, that fits chronologically there with the book of Judges there. So Ruth concludes, of course, with the proper name David, via the genealogies there, the last of the short genealogy there, beginning with Perez, there Ruth 4, 18 through 22. So really, in such a way, it fits. It's really a fitting introduction to the book of Samuel, which follows where David is, of course, anointed as God's chosen king. Nevertheless, in the Hebrew canon, of course, Ruth follows Proverbs, coming immediately after the acrostic there in Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31, concerning Esha Chayil, right, the virtuous woman, the woman of strength, the woman of valor. So this construction appears only 3 times, by the way, Esha Chayil. Only 3 times in the entire Hebrew Bible. It occurs in Proverbs 12:4, there in Proverbs 31:10, and again in Ruth 3:11, for example. So apparently, and it does seem there are numerous parallels, as we'll see, between Ruth and Esha Chayil, this virtuous woman of Proverbs 31, in which Ruth follows in the Hebrew canon. So it does seem that the canonical or editor, or whatever you want to call them, sought to present Ruth as an example of the virtuous woman described in Proverbs. In fact, Boaz speaks to Ruth in 3:11, saying that all the gate of his people know that she is a virtuous woman, that she is Esha Chayil. So those words not only repeat the epithet of the virtuous woman from Proverbs 31:10 at the beginning of the acrostic, but it also invokes language from the final clause in 31:31, which declares that her deeds, her works should praise her in the gates there. So as a result there, what you see in Proverbs and Ruth, the first and last clauses there of that acrostic, Proverbs 31:10 to 31, are taken up there in Ruth 3:11, as if Boaz is declaring that Ruth is the prime example of the virtuous woman. So David's line contains an ancestress of impeccable qualities, for example. But there's good reason why Ruth follows Proverbs in the Hebrew canon there. So I do want to talk about some links between Judges and Samuel. Just want to introduce a few of these to you to make note of. So the placement of Ruth after Proverbs was certainly done with a certain theological agenda in mind. And the sequence of Judges and Samuel is also accomplished with really undeniable links here. So a clear transition from Judges to Samuel. And so Gunn, for example, in his literary guide notes really a striking resonance between the opening of the narrative of the last judge, Samson, and Samuel's opening clause, for example, in Judges 13:2. Now there was a man from Zorah. And then we see in 1 Samuel 1:1, now there was a man from Ramathaim Zophim. So following in each of those narratives, in the Samson narrative and in the narrative there was Samuel, is the gift of a child to a barren woman. This is, of course, a major theme that's picked up from the Torah as well. But in both of these cases there, in Judges 13, so you had that final, remember we talked about the central core of the Judges there, the narratives of the Judges there from chapter 3 to 16. And then you got 17 through 21, which is different there. And so you've got this introduced. Now there was a man from Zorah there in Judges 13:2, 1 Samuel 1:1. Now there was a man from Ramathaim Zophim. And of course, we had this gift of a child to a barren woman in both of these narratives here. So the possibility, as some have noted here, exists then that Judges 17 through 21 could have been inserted between Judges 16 and 1 Samuel 1 during the final editing of the canon. That's a possibility, right? That some have noted. However, all right, I want to point this out. Some other evidence actually of parallels between the last chapters of Judges and First Samuel actually make this possibility more remote. There's actually an interesting transition from the final chapters of Judges right into the book of Samuel. So as we look at the conjunction there between Judges and Samuel, very interesting. So we have parallels between the final narratives of Judges and First Samuel 1, chapter 1, also evidenced by the repeated reference, the references that we see to a man who is either from the hill country of Ephraim or traveling to that tribal area. So, for example, in Judges 17 and 18, it is narrated the practice of idolatry with the participation of a Levite, right, who then goes with the Danites who take the idols by force in order to establish it in their new city as a perpetual practice, right, until the exile of the northern kingdom there. So in Judges 19 through 21, right, we've got a civil war with Benjamin is instigated by the homosexual rape and murder by the Benjamites of Gibeah and the concubine of a Levite traveling through there. So in Judges 17:1, let me see if I've got my PowerPoint. I don't have that up. Am I sharing screen with you? Am I sharing screen?
No, not at the moment.
Let me go ahead and bring that up. Sorry. Just so it's there. Sorry. Okay. Let me get that back up. Okay. All right. So as we're getting into Samuel here. Okay. That's what we're talking about here. The placement, canonically speaking, links between Judges and Samuel. The placement of Samuel after Judges is done with a certain theological agenda. And so right now I'm talking about the conjunction here between these. Okay. So I mentioned there between 17:1 there and this man from the hill country of Ephraim or going to the hill country of Ephraim. And so we also had there 19 there. A civil war with Benjamin is instigated. Again, I mentioned about the homosexual rape and murder by the Benjamites of Gibeah, the concubine there and the Levite that's traveling through there, through that area. So in Judges 17:1, right, we've got this this phrase. Now there was a man from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Micaiah. Judges 17:7. Now there was a young man from Bethlehem of Judah, from the family of Judah, and he was a Levite. Goes on, and the man went and he came to the hill country of Ephraim. That's Judges 17:7. And then we have Judges 19:1. Now there was a man, a Levite, sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim. And then again, you had Judges 17:1, Judges 19:1, which begins those new narratives there. And then we have 1 Samuel 1:1. Now there was a man from Ramathaim Zophim from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah. So we can appreciate here how 1 Samuel 1:1 actually combines elements of all three previous narrative openings. In chapter 13, there was Samson. In chapter 17 and in chapter 19, then the latter part, the epilogue of Judges, and now here in 1 Samuel 1:1 begins the same way. So when we consider the situation among the Levites of Judges 17, who were involved in idolatry, it is consistent with the immorality and the violence, by the way, among Eli's sons of 1 Samuel chapter 1 through 3. In Judges chapter 21, verses 15 through 24, we read there that the nation itself was condoning theft of women there at Shiloh, right? And so it is at Shiloh that Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, right, were consorting immorally with the local women. So we've got the tragic battles there, the civil wars there of Judges in chapter 19 and 20. Right? In those battles were set off by the actions of and the crimes that were done to a Levite and his concubine, while Hophni and Phinehas are killed and the ark is taken captive when they join the battle against the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 4. So what I want you to see here, right, say that to say this, we have these national disasters that are accompanied by disobedience among the Levites, right? The Levites in Judges and the Levites here in Samuel, the priest's sons there. So we have national disasters accompanied by disobedience among the Levites, which ties together quite closely the two books of Judges and Samuel. Now, the solution, of course, that is sought in the book of Judges is none other than a king. There was no king. There's this anticipation of a king. And when he comes, he's going to come from Judah, right? And so we've got this solution that's sought out in Judges, anticipated there at the end of Judges, is a king who will restore the nation. And so it is none other than the prophet Samuel who will usher, the book of Samuel, of course, will usher in the prophet Samuel, who is the final judge, and of course, the prophet who will anoint the king after God's own heart, in particular David, of course, after the anointing of Saul and the rejection of Saul as king. Now, the repeated phrase, in those days there was no king in Israel. We see that in 17:6, 18:1, 19:1, and 21:25, 4 times. And I mentioned already in 17:6 and 21:25, we had the added refrain, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In these final narratives of the book of Judges, it prepares the reader for the kingship that's going to be established through the last judge, Samuel, of course, in the following book. Now, the author of these words writes from the perspective of an established monarchy and signals to the reader that Judges is not to be read on its own. It's already anticipating there was no king in those days. Again, written from a later perspective, from the perspective of an established monarchy. Now, it should also be noted that Judges 17:6, Judges 18:1, and Judges 19:1, right, are all followed, right? Judges 17:6, Judges 18:1, and Judges 19:1 are all followed by references to events in the hill country of Ephraim in 17:8, 18:2, and 19:1. Now, interesting, that fourth and final reference to there was no king in Israel in those days in Judges 21:25, all right, it's repeating that phrase there, just as 17:6, 18:1, and 19:1 do. And of course, all of those are followed by the events in the hill country of Ephraim. In Judges 21:25, it again repeats the phrase, right? As I mentioned, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But in this case, there's no reference to the hill country of Ephraim that follows. Why? Because it's the end of the book of Judges. However, when the book of Samuel is affixed to Judges, when we go right into the book of Samuel, what do we see? Immediately, we have the reference to the hill country of Ephraim there in 1 Samuel 1, verse 1. So again, it's this seamless transition. So we have these close ties between Judges and Samuel that demonstrate, so literally the pattern, it's this seamless transition there. So again, the close ties between Judges and Samuel demonstrate again the evidence of an overall shaping of these books, I think even on the canonical level, as many have noted. Now, just as Joshua flows very nicely into Judges, so too Judges is followed by Samuel, as if there's not even a break. There's this seamless and cohesive transition from the book of Judges right into the book of Samuel. And now, having said that, nevertheless, the book of Samuel displays a structural and thematic integrity on its own, as we're going to look at here in just a moment. So let me move this here. All right, so talk a little bit about Samuel and the Torah, make a few observations here. So the opening chapter of Samuel narrates a very well-known literary motif, right? Hannah is the barren wife who conceives through divine intervention and gives birth to a major figure in the nation's life. I mean, this is a major motif that, I mean, you immediately pick up on this motif from the Torah. And so we see that this motif was, of course, seen in the life of Sarah, was seen in the life of Rebecca, was seen in the life of Rachel, by all the great matriarchs there. And so Samuel then, again, was presumably presented, he becomes a figure on par with Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham, right? He becomes a figure on par with not only Isaac, but also with Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and Joseph, who is the son of Rachel and Jacob there. So Samuel presumably becomes the figure on par with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, right? These sons these miracle children, these barren women. And so we should then expect a further outworking of the promises given to the patriarchs here in the book of Samuel. And Samuel is going to become a major figure and really a major period, transition period in the life of the nation here. So very interesting there. In the case of Sarah and Rachel, right, there existed rivalries. So that's another aspect among the wives, right, which precipitated the barrenness. And of course, this is the case that we see here in Samuel at the opening with Hannah and Peninnah as well. Bitter rivalries, in fact. So we also see that the Torah is dominated by great men who are shepherds, right, including righteous Abel from the beginning, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. Moses is a shepherd, right? So we see this motif of shepherding that is important in the Torah. And so David, of course, continues that tradition, being a shepherd who protects his flock from wild animals. And so Saul, not coincidentally, guess what? At the beginning of the book of Samuel is a shepherd as well. And in fact, he's presented in a very negative light. He's a shepherd who can't even find his donkeys. He can't find his animals, right? They've been lost and they're returned to him without his help. And so it's an interesting thing in the presentation of both Saul and David here in the book of Samuel, in light of the shepherd motif there in the Torah. Saul is presented as a shepherd. You know, his failure as a shepherd foreshadows his failure as a ruler of men, as shepherding the people of God, right? God's people. Likewise, you've got the presentation of David presented as a good shepherd later on in the book of Samuel, which is a portent, a foreshadowing of his success as a faithful ruler, shepherd of God's people. And of course, the parallels contrast them as being from the tribe of Judah and Benjamin there. But we've got this theme here of shepherding there, which is also highlighted in the book of Samuel with the shepherds who turn into kings, and how they shepherd is a portent of how they will shepherd God's people. The shepherd's staff, a powerful hand in the hands of Moses there. And of course, it's used to bring about the defeat of an oppressor like Pharaoh. Likewise, David's sling fells the powerful Philistine and frees Israel from domination. And so David, in many ways, is presented as a second Moses. Again, he's not the one we're anticipating, but certainly an important figure here in the life of the nation there. We see Samuel, David, Solomon are all paralleled to a long line of younger brothers in the Torah who surpassed their elders, right? Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over his brother, Joseph over all his brothers, right? Perez, right? There in Genesis 38, Ephraim. You recall there at the end when Jacob blesses Joseph's sons, right? Y'all remember what happens there. And the same thing with Moses as well, who is the younger of the brothers there. So we see that with Samuel, David, and Solomon, all who are parallel to a long line of younger brothers there. And so a number of motifs there from the Torah you see coming out here in the book of Samuel and this outworking. So we're anticipating here a continuation of God's work there in the Torah and his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That, again, as I mentioned before, will continue here in the book of Samuel. And so I do want to mention here before I go on, just to state this, in its original shape, Samuel was a single book, a single literary text. The division into two parts, right, into 1st and 2nd Samuel, is a secondary move. And it's likely due to the length, the size of the book, just as it was with the Torah, for scroll production and use of scroll. So again, so that's the idea there. So for example, we've got a Qumran scroll, 4Q Samuel A, again, dating to the 1st century, which includes text from both 1st and 2nd Samuel. The Talmud, for example, refers to it as a single book. And the Masoretic marginal notes, right, the Masoretes there, 1 Samuel 28, verse 24, is annotated as the midpoint of the book's verses. Well, if 1 Samuel was a book in its own right, 1 Samuel 28 is nowhere near the center point. Right, so the Masoretic endnotes giving verse totals is found only at 2 Samuel 24, not at the end of so-called 1 Samuel. So historically, it's always been read as a single literary unit, as a single book. And that's important, right? Because we want to read these individual passages in the context of, in the literary context of the book as a whole, right? We don't want to truncate that. We don't want to divorce it from its literary context, cut it off from that. Having said that, I do want to talk about Samuel here just a bit. The person of Samuel. Samuel is called a prophet of Yahweh. And I want to let me come out of this and make sure what I've got on some of my notes here. Okay, I'm going to make some comments before I get into that discussion. So Samuel's called a prophet of Yahweh in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and then in chapter 7 as well. He is referred to as a judge. So again, he's referred to explicitly as a prophet and as a judge. And again, this also goes well with Samuel's speech in 1 Samuel chapter 12, where he is included with the judges of the previous book. And so that speech really concludes the era of the judges and then inaugurates that of the monarchy. So this nice transition there in the book of Samuel, in particular, 1 Samuel chapter 12. So Samuel's speech signals the end of judgeship and the beginning of the monarchy. So he might not die until 1 Samuel 25, but from this point on, from 1 Samuel 12, from this point on, he's not a major character. The narrator shifts the focus from chapter 12 and following to the monarchy, whether it's Saul or David. Now Samuel's still on the scene, but again, he moves more to the background at that point, with Saul and David moving to the forefront. Likewise, by the way, Moses concludes his own era with a long discourse there in Deuteronomy, as we mentioned before, with an appeal to obedience in the future. And he also warns of the consequences if they don't obey. And so Solomon's discourse and prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8 at the dedication of the temple looks backwards and forward as well in Israel's history, with the usual warnings against apostasy for the nation. So specifically between the speeches of Samuel and Joshua, there are formal parallels as well. So there's an introduction in both cases in 1 Samuel 12 and Joshua 24. There's then followed with the antecedent history, what precedes there. They rehearsed the history leading up to that in 1 Samuel 12, 8 through 12. Joshua 24, 12, 2 to 13 does the same thing. Followed by that is a transition to the present, and now Va'atah, there in 1 Samuel 12, 13, Joshua 24, 14 does that. And then they both move into the requirements, right? 1 Samuel 12, verses 20 and 21, Joshua 24, 14, and then the blessings and curses that follow in 1 Samuel 12, 14, and 15, and 24, 25, and then Joshua 24, verse 20. So a lot of the same elements there. So you could say that chronologically, the real transition from Judges does not take place until 1 Samuel 12, right? Nonetheless, a literary break between both the books of Judges and Samuel seems to be real enough. Now, just as we looked at last week, with Joshua being portrayed as a second Moses, so Samuel also is characterized as a prophet like Moses. And so I want to look at some of these here. So some of the parallels here in the presentation of Samuel. Both were raised by godly mothers in their earliest years. Right? They were weaned by their mothers, right? Moses with Yocheved there under those circumstances before he was given to the house of Pharaoh. And of course, Samuel, who was weaned by his mother Hannah before he was given to the temple of the Lord, right? To the priest there. So both were raised by godly mothers, Yocheved and Hannah. Both were later raised away from their homes, as I mentioned, in the case of Moses, raised away from his home in Pharaoh's house. And of course, we see Samuel raised by the priest, Eli, there in the temple, there in the house of the Lord. Number 3, both Moses and Samuel received calls from God in the presence of burning objects. There in Exodus 3, the burning bush. 1 Samuel 3 as well, you have the fire there mentioned there that had not gone out there in the temple. And so it's interesting details. Why does the narrator add that? And so these are, again, further links there, the calling of both figures in the presence of burning objects. I'm not sure why else it would be irrelevant, quite frankly, in that narrative, although there may be other reasons as well this being certainly one of those. Number 4, God called both Moses and Samuel, repeating their names twice. So there in Exodus 3, he calls out from the burning bush, Moshe, Moshe. In 1 Samuel 3:10, he calls out to Samuel after Eli finally figured out what was going on. So, oh yeah, if he calls out to you again, this is how you'd answer. But the Lord calls out to Samuel twice, Shemuel, Shemuel, the same way he does to Moses in the presence of a burning object. Not only that, in both of their calls, there's numerous things here. They're called in the presence of a burning object. He calls their name twice. Not only that, both are apparently the only 2 prophets that are called faithful in the entire corpus of the Torah and former prophets. So using the root there, Aman. So they're in from Genesis to Kings. So both referred to as faithful. Number 6, both Moses and Samuel are commanded to pronounce judgment against the leaders of the sinful regimes that oppressed Israel during the initial phase of their prophetic careers. This is astonishing. I mean, it's not like you get like a trial run. It's not like you get a preseason. They're just going to throw you. I mean, God just calls them to the biggest task that you can imagine, right? There's no practice. There's no lead in, right? And so both are commanded to pronounce judgment against the leaders of the sinful regimes that oppressed Israel during the initial phase of their prophetic careers. Right off the bat, right out of the gate. So in Exodus, of course, God is calling Moses to go against the leader of which evil regime, right? Of Egypt, right? The Pharaoh who leads Egypt, the greatest power in the ancient Near East at the time, right? Now, it can be argued here that Samuel's call was a more daunting call, right? Keep in mind, God is calling Samuel, a young Samuel at that, to prophesy against God's man, the priest. Ooh. To me, that's probably more intimidating if God called me to prophesy against his own priest, against that leader who is oppressing Israel during the initial phase of his prophetic career. So I actually find as daunting as it is to go before Pharaoh, man, you better be right if you're going to prophesy against God's man there in the temple, right? So that was quite the daunting task there. Number 7, both Moses and Samuel killed an enemy of Israel with their own hands and then immediately leave the area. In Exodus 2, you guys are familiar. Moses sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite, and of course he kills him, buries him, and of course he flees. 1 Samuel 15. This is one that I just got to read. I can't just talk about it. I'm going to have to read this one. Y'all remember this is where Saul's rejected as king, and he spares King Agag when he was supposed to wipe out the Amalekites, right? They're supposed to. You had the ban; they weren't supposed to leave anything, right? So Saul, verse 7, attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But is a big word there. But Saul and the people spared Agag, the king, and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. So they were disobedient to the Lord's ban there, to this command to completely annihilate. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel. And indeed, he set up a monument for himself, and he has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. What? No, he hasn't. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. That's disingenuous. And the rest we have utterly destroyed. Then Samuel said to Saul, Be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, Speak on. So Samuel said, When you were little in your own eyes, Were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. He just doesn't get it, does he? But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me and brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal. Again, I'm going to offer it to the Lord. So Samuel said, and you guys are familiar with this, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams, right? For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. Finally, he recognized, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words, because I feared, notice what he says, the people, and obeyed their voice. He feared the people rather than God, and obeyed them rather than God. Notice what he says next, though. He acknowledges it, but then he goes on. Now, therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord, as if forget about it. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned around to go away, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. So Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also the strength of Israel will not lie nor relent, for he is not a man that he should relent. Then he said, I have sinned. And notice what Saul says next. Yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people. So in front of the people, honor me, because he cares more about what the people think. So honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, bring Agag, king of the Amalekites, here to me. So Agag came to him cautiously. Oh, I can imagine this point. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house at Gibeah of Saul. Wow. What an incredible narrative there, and what happened there. And of course, you see the book of Esther picks up on this idea there, and the battle with Haman, the Agagite, right? A descendant of Saul, right? Because of Saul's disobedience there are consequences later on, and a reversal, by the way, of things from Saul's reign to what happens with Mordecai and Esther there in the book of Esther, dealing with Haman, the Agagite. But anyways, nonetheless, both Moses and Samuel kill an enemy of Israel with their own hands and immediately leave the area. Number 8, both Moses and Samuel wrote down regulations or judgments, mishpatim, that were deposited in a holy place before the Lord. Of course, Moses deposits the Decalogue, for example, right? The tablets of stone there in the Ark of the Covenant. Well, the same thing there, the laying out before the temple there in 1 Samuel 10 with Samuel. Both Moses, right, Exodus 18, and Samuel, 1 Samuel 7 mentions they were both judges of the nation. Not only that, both Moses and Samuel were referred to as prophets. So both were judges and both were prophets. Number 11, both Moses and Samuel built altars to the Lord in their role that they played. Number 12, interestingly enough, both Moses and Samuel performed priestly activities without ever really being designated specifically as priests. So Moses did it, Samuel did it as well. Not only that, both Moses and Samuel, not only were they from the tribe of Levi, but they were from the Levitical subtribe of Kohat, according to 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and 6. They perform priestly duties, and they're from the same sub-tribe of Levi. Number 13, both Moses and Samuel oversaw an important transition from one era to another in Israelites' history. So Moses, again, this great deliverer, lawgiver, and so on, oversees the transition from bondage and slavery there in Egypt to becoming God's people there, the establishment of the Sinai covenant, and so on, and bringing them to the precipice of the land which God had promised them. And now here we have Samuel, who's also seeing a major transition in the life of God's people there, this transition from the period of the judges to the monarchy. And so both of these figures, very important. You guys know how important transitions are in any ministry. And so we see both of these guys overseeing major transitions. Number 14, both Moses and Samuel had two sons mentioned in the text. And in both cases, neither of them consecrated them to leadership roles in the nation, but rather both Moses and Samuel consecrated others that God had chosen, as opposed to their sons to carry on the work. So we got quite a number of parallels between Moses and Samuel. Now, as we talk about the literary structure of Samuel, so a number of things. So I've kind of given you a little bit of a picture there, trying to see some of the from Judges to Samuel to Kings, just to pick up on some things that I want to talk about here. You'll notice that Samuel, by the way, I've got there mentioned the transition there from the latter chapters there. There was no king, the anticipation of a king from the end of Judges there. The tabernacle in Shiloh, bookending the book of Samuel. Shiloh, the tabernacle in Shiloh is destroyed at the end of Samuel. The future side of the temple mentioned there, and of course the temple bookends the book of Kings as well, which is there in Zion, and of course the where it's going to be built there in Zion and destroyed by the end of Kings. But the book of Samuel is again primarily narrative, right? And so it is a narrative, and it's punctuated with these poetic themes. Namely, we have these Hannah's prayer there, 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10, which is a poetic theme there. It is messianic, have reference to this messianic king. And 2 Samuel 22 through 23:7 is also poetry, David's prayer on the other end of the book of Samuel, which also refers to the Messiah, the anointed, that is, and the king as well. And so you have these two poetic themes there, bookending, framing, right, the book of Samuel. So it helps frame our understanding of these narratives and what God is doing in the book of Samuel. And of course, at the central portion of the book of Samuel is the establishment of the Davidic covenant there. Now, I want to kind of work through this a little bit. So again, many have recognized the parallels between 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10, Hannah's prayer, and 2 Samuel 22 through 23, verse 7. Again, we have these two poetic passages with messianic overtones. Now, less people, all right, so many have recognized that, and I've got those poetic themes highlighted there, and of course, the parallels between them I'll mention here. But less people have noted the correspondences between 1 Samuel 1 and 2 Samuel 24 on the outer extremities of the text there, which deal with the tabernacle and, of course, the future side of the temple as well. So it's interesting there. 2 Samuel, or the book of Samuel, ends where 1 Samuel began. So the book of Samuel ends where the book of Samuel began, right? So we've got a stable and functioning shrine, right? Albeit, as one Rosenberg put it, he says 2 Samuel thus ends where 1 Samuel began, with a stable and functioning shrine, albeit a troubled and haunted one, end quote. Right, so we got bookended there, this shrine, the tabernacle there, surrounding the book there. This is important, again, even from the Torah, and this anticipation that God is going to tabernacle with his people there, even recreated, that kind of thing. So that's also framing the book of Samuel, along with these poetic themes, speaking of this, with these messianic overtones, speaking of this coming king. So the book opens with the tabernacle and the ark there at Shiloh. and the book of Samuel ends with the future site of the temple identified. However, at the end of the book of Samuel, the Shiloh site is destroyed. Now, in the following book, in the book of Kings, that book also begins with a temple built by Solomon, but by the end of that same book, the temple is destroyed again. So if the tabernacle site encloses the book of Samuel, so does the temple site. It encloses the book of Kings. So now keep in mind as well, David had sought to build the temple, but he was denied there in 2 Samuel 7, right? He was denied that privilege. So at least now the site has been identified, but its builder will not be revealed until the next book, right? So the links between Judges and Samuel include the Shiloh site, right? Judges 21, verses 12, 19, and 21. We see that mentioned there in 1 Samuel 1:3. So we see further links between Judges and Samuel, including the Shiloh site. And I had that noted there on the PowerPoint there for you as well. And also, we had the links there between Samuel and Kings, right? The Arana, or the future temple site, which I've got noted there as well at the end of Samuel, there in the 2 Samuel 24, future site of the temple there, and of course the Temple of Zion. So we had these transitions, seamless transitions there across these books there. Now, the royal house that will build that temple is the subject of the two parallel poetic narratives between these two chapters at the extremes. So again, the royal house that will build that temple is the subject of those poetic scenes there between those two chapters at the outer extremities there. So it is quite interesting here that the book opens with Eli seated as a priest king at the doorway of the temple there in 1 Samuel 1:9, from which, by the way, he falls off in chapter 4 and dies, right? But the book then concludes with David, another priest king, if you will. So if you look at 2 Samuel, chapter 6:14, for example, it concludes with another priest king here, essentially with David there, building an altar and offering sacrifice on behalf of Israel in order to stop the plague at the very place where the temple would be built. That's interesting there. Now, I mentioned the poetic seams there, the poetic parallels here. And so let's see here. All right. So there are extensive parallels between Hannah's prayer there in 1 Samuel 2 and David's prayer there as the poetic theme there in 2 Samuel 22 through 23:7. Again, both of those passages with these messianic overtones. Sorry, I was walking through this, but I didn't show you this. Sorry. So again, I mentioned the royal house that will build that temple is the subject of these two poetic passages there between these outer chapters here. So again, these two poetic passages act as a messianic and eschatological frame around the book, and they resonate with the prophecy at the heart of the book, 2 Samuel 7, given to David concerning an eternal dynasty. Now, looking at these parallels, so these poetic texts there, Hannah's prayer for Samuel 2 and David's there in 2 Samuel 22 through 23:7, surrounding the book correspond both lexically and thematically, right? Highlighting the thematic agenda of the writer. So these two poetic passages act as a messianic and eschatological frame around the book, and as I mentioned, resonate with the prophecy in 2 Samuel 7, given to David. Now, Hannah's prayer thus takes on the implications and describes scenarios that are far beyond her immediate situation. And thereby they become prophetic in nature, foreseeing the future king and Messiah from the period of the judges. And in fact, it is expressly stated that she is praying this prayer. She is doing so from the period of the judges. Who is this Messiah? Who is this king that she's speaking of? There is no monarchy yet. Okay. So you have to say it's at least prophetic on some level, right? Further, Hannah's description of the exaltation of the lowly and the debasing of the arrogant and the high becomes programmatic for the events throughout the book. So that's something that's parallel, contrasted there in Hannah's prayer, and that fleshes out in the book of Samuel. So whether it's Saul, whether it's David, whether it's other figures, Hannah and Peninnah there, the exaltation of the lowly, the humble, the people of God, and the debasing of the proud. So Hannah's prayer also takes on a programmatic role for the book of Samuel as well. So we see that theme bearing out in the book of Samuel as well. So for the writer, the author, the final editor, whatever you want to call them, and so Hannah's words were included because they predicted the rise of David and his dynasty and were consonant with David's own prophetic words that we see at the other end of Samuel there. And so as we look at these parallels, we're going to see, interesting, the final focus in both poems is the Lord's king and his Messiah, the one who is going to fulfill the covenant with David. And so we'll look at 2 Samuel 23 here in just a moment. And so interestingly enough here, I'm just putting up here on the screen for you, because it's very difficult to go through all of it. And I'm just trying to give you a sense of the parallels, not only lexically, but also thematically. Sometimes it's entire clauses, but all the parallels between David's prayer and Hannah's prayer. And so notice there in verse 1, all the language there, and of course the parallels in David's prayer. Verse 2 and all the way through, you can see the language there used there, including there in verse 10, the language to his king, to his Messiah, which is anointed one, using Melech and Mashiach there. And that's used, of course, in both of these parallel passages here, these poetic themes here. So as we look at this, and I want to make this point, there's not a single verse in Hannah's prayer that lacks a parallel with David's prayer. And in fact, as I mentioned already, in some cases, the parallels extend to entire phrases. So not a single verse in Hannah's prayer lacks parallel with David's prayer. Also, Hannah's raised horn of 1 Samuel 2:1 forms an inclusio within Hannah's prayer with the raised horn of the Messiah and the King of 2:10. So that bookends Hannah's prayer itself. So we see even some structure there within Hannah's prayer. So in other words, the same Yahweh who raised her horn from disdain will also raise up the King Messiah. So we've got, again, as I mentioned already, this common theme of raising the humble and debasing the proud, which resonates between both of these as well. The speaker in 2 Samuel 22 is David, who is saved from his enemies. And by the way, so Hannah prophesies that Yahweh would give strength to his anointed king. However, 1 Samuel 2:10 seems to go beyond David to an eschatological and universally ruling king. The word pair king and anointed Messiah is repeated in both poems, as I mentioned already there, is a major reason, most likely, for the parallel placement of each poem surrounding, bookending this book. Even after David's sin, right, and the resulting chaos that takes place in his household, right? You guys remember, right? He sins with Bathsheba, right? He loses his son. There's death. There's rape. There's even his own son took over, and so you had this major turmoil within his household for the rest of his days. Yea, even beyond David's lifetime, we see that continue. So even after David's sin and resulting chaos that unfolds in his own household, the promise to him and to his seed is eternal, according to 2 Samuel 22:51. Right? God's promise is unconditional. So regardless of the sin, God's promise is still secure. And so in 2 Samuel 22:51, for example, mentions, just read that, he is the tower of salvation to his king and shows mercy to his anointed, to David and his descendants forevermore. Right? So in fact, the phrase ad olam of 2 Samuel 22:51, that's what's used there, is taken directly from 2 Samuel 7:13, and also in verse 16, stated twice, where David is promised an eternal dynasty. So then in 2 Samuel 23, verse 5, David refers directly to that covenant as eternal once again. Right? Since these are the last words of David, according to 2 Samuel 23, it says, now these are the last words of David. Thus says David, the son of Jesse. Thus says the man raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and his word was on my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke to me. By the way, this is language we see from Hannah's prayer. He who rules over men this king must be just. ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be like the light of the morning when the sun rises, a morning without clouds, like the tender grass springing out of the earth, by clear shining after the rain. And literally in the Hebrew, what it says in verse 5, David says, not so my house with God. He describes the righteous rule of Messiah and says, that's not my house. And then he follows that up, right? Yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, directly referring back to 2 Samuel 7, right? And the promise of this one who will come through the line of David, who will sit on the throne. So, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant. Notice what he says, ordered in all things and secure, for this is all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not make it increase? Woo! Right? So here in 2 Samuel 23:5, he refers directly to that covenant as eternal once again. And since these are the last words of David, according to verse 1 in that chapter, the fulfillment of that covenant has yet to be seen, according to David. Right? According to this text here. Now, Hannah's prophecy of a king in 1 Samuel 2:10 resonates with the repeated refrain at the end of Judges. No doubts in 17:6, 18:1, 19:1, and 21:25, right? Which forms another link with Judges and Samuel. Again, she's praying from the period of the Judges. They're anticipating a king. So since the awaited king of Hannah's prayer is clearly beyond David, and I think David affirms that idea and the parallels there in the book of Samuel, the king awaited in Judges likely is to be seen as eschatological and messianic as well, this one who will effect righteousness. David's own household descended into the kind of moral anarchy that is seen in the book of Judges, and so David did not cure Israel. He was not the cure for that. And even his own family, right, of doing what was right in their own eyes. There was this moral anarchy that took place within his own household. That's where David says, not so my house. He's not the ultimate answer there, right? So as a result, a messianic hope ties Judges and Samuel together and envelops, right? It bookends, it envelops the entire book of Samuel as well. Not only that, the phrase, the ends of the earth, right? That language there in 1 Samuel 2:10 is also found in Psalm 2:8, right? The ends of the earth, that's the dominion of Messiah. Repeatedly throughout Scripture. We see that in Psalm 2:8, Psalm 72:8, Micah 5:3, Zechariah 9:10. All of these contexts with reference to the rule of Messiah to the ends of the earth. And so his dominion is to the ends of the earth. We see that there in 1 Samuel 2:10. So there's a noted parallel with David's words in 2 Samuel 22:41, where he says, and my enemies, you gave me their neck. Well, that's interesting. That goes back to Jacob's words back in Genesis 49. I'm sorry, I left out the verse there. Back in Genesis 49. So Jacob's words, speaking of this king who is to come through the line of Judah in Genesis 49, where he says, your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. And this is the language that David uses here. And my enemies, you gave me their neck. Let me just go back and make sure the exact reference is Genesis 49, verse 8. Genesis 49, verse 8 there. So we have that language there as well. So placed roughly halfway between these two messianic poems, as I mentioned, at either end of the book, is, of course, the eternal covenant that is made with David, there at the heart of the book of Samuel. So the righteous rule that's described, as I mentioned already in 2 Samuel 23:3 and 4, is not exactly a description, to say the least, of David's reign, as he even admits in verse 5. Not so my house with God, right? So David's house was not that way. And in fact, we see that narrated quite powerfully in the book of Samuel. We see that in Kings as well. So David's house was not that way, and all his salvation and desire has not yet come to fruition. But as he says there again, right? Not so my house with God, yet he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. He's coming, in other words. And by the way, he says, for this is all my salvation and all my desire. Will he not make it increase? So his trust is in this future work of God, what God has promised. He is still believing and hoping, and this is an eternal covenant which God has made. And so David's house was not that way, and all his salvation and desire has not yet come to fruition. But he's coming. God is faithful to his promises. So the covenant remains in effect, nonetheless, according to David. and he assures the rule of light and righteousness will indeed come. Um, so, um, the same really sad story dominates the major part of Kings, right? And the reader is perhaps wondering when we get to the end of Kings, right? When will the righteous messianic king come? Because by the end of Kings, what has become of the house of David? The house of David is in exile. The house of David is seemingly no more. What has become of the promises of God, right? So this continues on into the book of Kings, this anticipation of this one who is to come. So we'll deal with that when we get to Kings here. But the final chapters of Judges, again, presume a later king will solve the moral problem. But the kings of Samuel simply do not accomplish this. As David admits, as narrated, right, as illustrated through the narratives, not only in the life of Saul, who affects disobedience not only himself, but on the people, and also in the life of David and his family, and all the events that transpired as a result. So that's illustrated quite powerfully in the narratives that they do not solve the moral problem here in the book of Samuel. So nevertheless, though, literarily, right, these texts keep before us, right, this hope of a more worthy king, right, is kept before the reader, especially by these poetic texts bookending Samuel and the Davidic covenant there at the heart, at the center of the book of Samuel. So again, the very framework of the book of Samuel is messianic, I would argue there. So, and this hope David still has, even though he has failed in that regard, right? God is faithful to his covenant with David for this king that will come through his line. All right. Also want to mention here as well Hannah's prophecy as a program or programmatic for the book of Samuel, which I already mentioned a little bit earlier. So before I move on to that, did anybody have any comments there on that? At this point? Okay. I just want to mention a few things about Hannah's prophecy as well. Not only its parallels with David's prayer, bookending, framing the book of Samuel structurally as a whole, but also, again, serving as a program for the book of Samuel. So it's a number of things going on here. So looking at, I'll just go ahead and put these up here. Oops, sorry. Go back. So with Hannah and Peninnah, Eli's sons and Samuel, Dagon and Yahweh's ark, Saul and David. So for example, Hannah and Peninnah, right there from the outset. So from verses 3 through 8 there in 1 Samuel 2, the main theme there, or one of the major themes there, is how God reverses the fortunes of both the exalted and the lowly, right? So the people, the ones who are to be brought low, according to the text, are the boastful in verse 3, the arrogant in verse 3, the mighty in verse 4, the fool in verse 5, the rich in verse 7, the wicked in verse 9, and those who contend with God there in verse 10, right? Those are the Christians. Those are the ones who are going to be brought low. The ones who will be exalted are the feeble, verse 4, the hungry, verse 5, the barren, verse 5, the poor, verse 7, the lowly, verse 7, the needy, verse 8, and the godly in verse 9. Those are the ones who will be exalted. So, interestingly, Hannah herself ended up with 6 children, according to 1 Samuel 2:21, after being taunted, if you will, by her enemy, Peninnah, there in chapter 1, for having none. So not only did Hannah have children, but her eldest son, right, Samuel, became the prophet of God for his generation and an anointer of kings. I mean, that's pretty impressive. So she started out hungry, if you will. She started out barren. She started out godly, right? And she was then exalted. Peninnah, her enemy, was arrogant, verse 6. She was full, verse 2, right? But she was clearly outdone by Hannah in the end, right? You look at Eli's sons and Samuel, for example. You read in 1 Samuel 2:16 how Eli's sons took meat by force from the people, for example. And they're said in verse 17 to despise the offering of the Lord. And so, in essence, they were arrogant, they were wicked, they were full, right? So, their death in chapter 4, quite frankly, was a predictable event. And the godly, right, according to 2:11, 18, and 26, right, Samuel's rise, all right, we see likewise as well. So, we can anticipate the rise of Samuel as well. So the bringing down, the debasing of the wicked, Eli's sons, and the exaltation, the raising up of Samuel there in the book. So again, based on Hannah's prayer there, we can see this as programmatic. What about Dagon and the Ark of the Lord? So when the Philistines, if you recall, took the Ark of God, they and their gods had presumably in their minds conquered Israel and their God, right? Their God was greater than Israel's God, is their mindset, right? However, in chapter 5, verse 3, beginning there, we read how Dagon had fallen down on its face before the ark. Y'all remember that? And the very next evening, right, they set him up and he falls again and he loses his head and hands, right, and so on. So there's this bringing down, debasing of their false god, this idol, before the ark of the Lord itself. And of course, we see the eventual removal of the ark from the Philistines there. We also see this with Saul. So with Saul, the initial attitude of Saul when Samuel speaks to him, if you recall, reveals great humility, right? I mean, he's like, who is he, right? He declares that his tribe, Benjamin, was the least of all the tribes, and his family was the least within that tribe, right? In fact, he doesn't even tell some of his family the fact that Samuel had anointed him as a ruler in chapter 10. And when it came time to identify him as the new king at a national gathering there, Saul was nowhere to be found, right? So when the sons of Belial despised him in chapter 10, he did nothing. He said nothing in his own defense, right? I mean, he was humble in his own eyes. When others sought to kill these detractors after Saul's victory, he refused it, right? So this all begins to change when Saul, there in chapter 13, begins to think a bit too much of himself and begins to offer sacrifices which he should not have done. So this was a role that was reserved for Samuel the prophet. So his descent begins immediately in the next chapter 14, where Jonathan is the one who wins the battle alone according to the text, expressing faith in that case in Yahweh, not in numbers, right? So in fact, that's what Saul had failed to do in chapter 13. So fearing the fact that his people had deserted him. So Saul continues to express more interest in the praise of men, as we just read in chapter 15 as well, rather than the praise and honor from God, as we see there in 1 Samuel 15, which I read just a moment ago. So eventually Saul dies and his family is reduced to one crippled man, according to 2 Samuel 3 and 2 Samuel chapter 9. All right, so we see him starting off good and he's elevated, and then he becomes proud and arrogant in his own eyes, and he is debased. He is brought low and removed from that place of elevation. Same thing with David. Interesting here. From the very first appearance of David in 1 Samuel 16, we see that he was not even considered by his own father when it came time to present the family before Samuel. When he was looking for the next king to anoint, they don't even bring David before Samuel. His own older brother went further and accused him of wickedness in chapter 17, having bad intentions coming there to see them. So David protests, of course, that he was only asking a question, right? And when Saul questions him, right, he responds that deliverance belongs to the Lord, right? It's what the Lord does. So in spite of the fact that David has been anointed, not only that, he does not behave arrogantly before Saul, the man that he knows he's going to replace. In fact, he's not going to raise a hand against the Lord's anointed. So if Saul's humble attitude before exaltation lasted a short while, David continued, actually, according to the text, for a lengthy period of time, suffering before Saul. And he doesn't take matters into his own hands, right? So when he's offered the king's daughter as a wife, right, David responds there in chapter 18, and it was a similar response to that of Saul in chapter 9. So he didn't consider himself, he didn't consider his family as being worthy of such an honor to receive the daughter of the king. So when David is given, of course, the chance, the opportunity to kill Saul, he doesn't do it. And in fact, he even feels guilty for taking part of Saul's robe, just kind of sending that message there. He felt guilty about that. So he then deprecates himself before Saul, right, after having the opportunity to kill him. Again, in chapter 26, David refrains from killing Saul once again, right? And so he leaves vengeance to the Lord, right? He's not going to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. He then deprecates himself again in Saul's presence. Now, when Saul dies, David takes vengeance on those who killed Saul and his son Ishbosheth. So when his wife Michal, if you recall, despises David when he's dancing before the ark of the Lord, right, in his linen ephod there, right? Michal despises him. David declares that he will be lightly esteemed. He will become even more undignified and humble in his own eyes there. And so he responds to the covenant that's made with him at the heart of the book, 2 Samuel 7, again, by deprecating himself and his own house in the sight of God. So David's humility really, is seen throughout for extended time, but his humility begins to cease really in the case of Uriah the Hittite, where you could argue that he arrogantly takes advantage of him and essentially has him murdered, placing him on the front lines there. However, David does admit his sin. He confesses his sin in 2 Samuel 12. But as a result of his sin, David's own son rises up against him. All right. And while fleeing from Jerusalem, if y'all recall, Shimei, one who's from Saul's family there, cursed David along the way. David's response there in 2 Samuel 16 is to save Shimei's life and to look to the Lord for relief. And now, after David's victory, David again was urged to kill Shimei, but he refrains from doing so. So apparently here, David's attitude has changed, and now ultimately David is restored to his kingdom. He's restored to his throne after demonstrating humility. So it seems to become clear that the Lord is exalting and debasing people in the book of Samuel according to the principles that are laid out at the very beginning of the book of Samuel in Hannah's prayer. So just looking at just another aspect here literarily, how Hannah's prayer is functioning as a program in the book of Samuel. Again, bookending with David's prayer and anticipating this king and so on as well, certainly, which I mentioned before, talking about these parallels. All right. Now, there's more that I'd like to say. There's some interesting parallels between David and Israel, which I would like to talk about. Maybe I could do that at the beginning of next class. I don't know. But that will suffice for the moment here. We're up against the time here. So I'm going to go ahead and go back here. Any thoughts, observations, or questions, anything at this point that you guys would like to add to that?
Dr. Lyon, it was very interesting. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it's the more you look at this, the more you see just the literary genius. Not only it's presented as part of this history, and it's part of what I was talking about before last week. This is prophetic history. This is not just the historical books. This is prophetic text, and so the history, the life of the nation itself is prophetic in every sense, from the development from the Sinai covenant and the conditional nature of that covenant, and the blessings and the cursings and so on that they would experience, the contingent upon their faith or lack of faith, their disobedience or obedience, to the promise of this one who is to come, and so on. All these things are interwoven quite masterfully, I would argue, in the prophetic corpus, namely, as we're looking now at the former prophets here. So it's not just history, but this is prophetic history in every sense. Other observations or questions, or just anything you might add to that? I'm happy to hear anything that you guys would add to that. All right, well, you guys are easy to please tonight.
The RPM was on the high side for me tonight, just for the few days that I've had, so I apologize, but it is remarkable how extensive the parallels are. I will comment there.
Yeah, that's something I encourage you guys to take
Yep.
further look at. I could only really just
Yep.
kind of show you at a glance, just to illustrate that. But as you read David's prayer, I mean, you're seeing stuff from Hannah's prayer, and just the shaping of that. I mean, clearly bookending this the way that it does. So there's a number of things going on literarily there that are quite interesting to look at the development as it records this real history and works in and through his people. But not only that, how he has revealed this in a certain way and how he is interpreting this history for us, how we are to understand this, right? And so just a lot of fun looking at this. All right, so if there's no thoughts or comments on this moving forward, what we're going to do next week, I want to, for the first part, I do want to discuss Kings. I don't want to not discuss Kings, okay? And then, so maybe what I'll do is limit it to the first hour, not go beyond that, so that we can leave 2 hours to work through. I believe what's on the schedule is to work through some of the Hebrew texts there, Hannah's prayer, David's prayer, and the Davidic covenant. So you guys, that's really the biggest assignment you have left, other than, you know, kind of your paper at the end. So you get this done, or mostly done, you're sitting in pretty good shape. Okay. But we want to have discussion there. And I'm going to leave it pretty open. So at least I've discussed giving you an introduction to Samuel and giving you some framework, if you will, with those passages there to further discuss. If you guys want to explore some of that stuff, and as we look at some text, we can, you know, feel free to kind of chase some of the things that you guys want to look at from the text next week. So we'll give you guys some freedom there. I think we've got that freedom to do, since we've already introduced that this week. Okay. So feel free to have some passages, you know, some verses or some issues that you want to look at. You know, we can do that next week. We can have some fun with that. But I think what we'll plan to do here is, I was hoping to get through Kings tonight, but that's okay. Maybe I just devote the first 45 minutes to an hour, you know, that range there, and then at least the last 2 hours we'll deal with the Hebrew text there, where you guys can further explore some of these things. So you got some introduction here. You guys have been reading stuff on your own. You guys have studied this on your own as well. So bringing all that to the table, you'll do the translations and commentary. So bringing that to the table, looking forward to what you guys want to discuss and look at within those passages next week. So that's the plan for next week. Any questions? Okay, excellent. The only other thing I have is, for those of you that I didn't speak with, I just want to make sure that I want to nail down the passage and what you want to look at for your paper. I can stick around for a minute now or two now, or we can schedule it for tomorrow, the next day, whatever works for you. But let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer. And I'll tell you what, Josh, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer?
Certainly not. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Father, thank you for this day. We thank you for the material that we've been able to engage with this evening. We thank you for the tremendous impact that your word has in our lives. Thank you for your grace to us, that we have this opportunity to do that together. And Father, I pray your blessing on each of the men here this evening. Pray for wisdom, pray for perseverance and determination as well. We thank you. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I appreciate you guys, and look forward definitely next week to the discussion you guys bring to the table. If you have any issues or questions between now and then, let me know. Again, I don't mind if you call or text as well, besides email, that's fine. So have a great night. I'll stick around for a minute if anybody needs, but otherwise just text, call, whatever. We set up time to, you know, just a few moments to talk. So God bless you guys.
Right. Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you. Good night.
All right.
You got
Mark,
it.
did you want to quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I know we talked about last time I was in this class, my idea was I wanted to work on chapter 23 of Joshua and really kind of building on what I'd written about Deuteronomy 30, which is why I wanted to stick with that. And and really it's developing themes that then carry on through the former prophets and into the rest of the Tanakh. So I really want to kind of try to approach it that way and develop, especially the tension between, I wanted to do 23 because he's talking to the elders. This is his kind of farewell address to the elders there. And it's interesting to draw the distinction between what he says to them and what he says to the people in in Joshua 24, when he says you're not going to be able to obey, there's the elders, he says, obey the Lord, obey the commandments, obey the Torah, and it'll be well with you. But then to the people, he says you can't serve the Lord, which is basically what Moses said. And then when you get into Judges, you see this idea of, the people obeyed the Lord through